March 19, 1945, 50 miles off the coast of Kyushu, Japan. The pre-dawn darkness still clings to the horizon when Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taylor steps onto the flight deck of the USS Franklin. His boots echo against steel plating that's already vibrating with the rumble of 32 aircraft engines warming up below. Around him, the controlled chaos of a carrier at battle stations unfolds, plane handlers in yellow jerseys guiding Hellcats and Corsairs into launch positions, ordnancemen making final checks on bomb loads, and pilots climbing into cockpits with that particular mixture of adrenaline and routine that comes from being this close to enemy territory. The Franklin CV-13 to the Navy, Big Ben to her crew, is a floating city of 2,600 men, bristling with aircraft and ammunition. This morning, she's loaded for bear. Her hangar deck is packed with 31 aircraft being armed and fueled for the next strike wave. On the flight deck above, another 31 planes sit ready, their wings heavy with bombs and rockets destined for Japanese airfields on Kyushu. This is the largest concentration of armed aircraft the Franklin has ever carried at one time. Taylor watches aviation ordnanceman Third Class Robert Blanchard and his team roll a 500-pound bomb toward a Helldiver dive bomber. The weapon gleams dully in the deck lights, one of dozens being loaded in the frantic final preparations. Below deck, fuel lines snake through the hangar, topping off tanks. The smell of aviation gasoline hangs thick in the enclosed space, mixing with the odor of hydraulic fluid and hot metal. Captain Leslie Garris surveys his ship from the bridge, 52 feet above the flight deck. He's a tough, no-nonsense officer who came up through the ranks the hard way, starting as an enlisted man before earning his commission. Under his command, the Franklin has survived kamikaze attacks, launched strikes against Formosa and Okinawa, and spent the last 72 hours pounding Japanese positions in preparation for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa, just 150 miles to the south. The Franklin is part of Task Group 58.2, operating with the carriers Wasp, Hancock, and Bataan under Rear Admiral Ralph Davison. But this morning, a thick cloud bank has separated the Franklin from her sister carriers. She's alone, save for the screening destroyers circling in her wake, and just 50 miles from an enemy coastline bristling with airfields. At 7:07 a.m., the ship's radar picks up a bogey, an unidentified aircraft, but the contact is lost almost immediately in the ground clutter from the nearby Japanese islands. On the flight deck, Commander Stephen Jurika Jr., the ship's air operations officer, is focused on launching the next strike. Plane handlers are positioning aircraft, final checks are being made. The Franklin is at her most vulnerable, loaded with fuel, armed with bombs, and with her crew scattered across a dozen different tasks. Nobody on the bridge sees the Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber until it's already screaming down through the cloud cover at nearly 400 miles per hour. Lieutenant Junior Grade James Dixon is standing near the base of the island superstructure when something makes him look up. For one frozen instant, he sees the sleek profile of the Japanese bomber emerging from the gray clouds at a nearly vertical angle, the red meatball insignia stark against its fuselage. Then his training kicks in and he's shouting, "Dive bomber! Dive bomber!" But the words are lost in the sudden roar of the ship's anti-aircraft guns opening up. The 20mm and 40mm guns chatter and bark, throwing up a wall of steel, but they're seconds too late. The Judy pilot, likely a veteran who survived this long by being good and lucky, has timed his approach perfectly. He releases two 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs from 1,000 feet and banks away, his aircraft shuddering through the flak. The first bomb hits the flight deck 30 feet from the center line, just aft of the forward elevator. It punches through the 3-inch thick wooden deck like paper, through the gallery deck below, and detonates in the hangar deck, where 31 fully armed and fueled aircraft are packed together. The explosion is catastrophic. The blast wave from the first bomb tears through the hangar deck at supersonic speed, an expanding sphere of superheated gas and shrapnel that shreds everything in its path. Aviation machinists mate second-class Grady dice, is standing near a Corsair fighter when the world transforms into fire and flying metal. The bomb detonates less than 40 feet from where he's working, and the overpressure alone is enough to rupture organs and collapse lungs. Men closer to the blast simply cease to exist, vaporized or torn apart so completely that nothing identifiable remains. But it's what happens next that transforms a catastrophic explosion into an apocalyptic inferno. The bomb has detonated in the exact center of the Franklin's vulnerability, surrounded by armed aircraft, puddles of aviation gasoline, and oxygen lines running to welding stations. The explosion ruptures fuel tanks on a dozen planes simultaneously. 6,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel ignites in an instant, creating a fireball that expands through the enclosed hangar deck at nearly 300 feet per second. The temperature spikes to over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Then the bombs start cooking off. The tiny TIM rockets mounted under a Corsair's wings, each 11 feet long and carrying 150 pounds of explosive, ignite like Roman candles. They tear loose from their launch rails and shoot through the hangar deck in random directions, some punching through the 3-inch thick steel bulkheads, others ricocheting wildly before exploding. One rocket screams through an open hatch and detonates in a berthing compartment, killing 30 men in their bunks. On the flight deck, Commander Jurica is thrown flat by the force of the explosion beneath his feet. When he rolls over, he sees the forward elevator, a massive platform weighing several tons, rising into the air like a playing card caught in an updraft. It lifts 40 feet, flips completely over, and crashes back down onto the deck in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The second Japanese bomb hits 3 seconds after the first. This one strikes further aft, penetrating the flight deck and detonating on the gallery deck, just outside the ship's Combat Information Center. Lieutenant Commander McGregor Kilpatrick is at his radar station when the bulkhead beside him simply disappears in a flash of white light and a wall of flame. The blast kills him and 14 other men instantly, and wipes out the Franklin's ability to track aircraft or coordinate her defense. But worse, far worse, this second explosion triggers a chain reaction in the dozens of armed aircraft still parked on the flight deck. Ensign John Stiles is running toward his battle station when a 500-pound bomb detonates on a Helldiver dive bomber 30 yards away. The blast picks him up and hurls him 20 feet through the air. He lands hard, his ears ringing, temporarily deaf and disoriented. When his vision clears, he sees something from a nightmare. The entire forward section of the flight deck has become a landscape of fire and destruction. Aircraft are burning, their aluminum skin melting and dripping like candle wax. Bombs are exploding in a continuous, overlapping cacophony. Rockets are launching themselves in every direction, trailing corkscrew paths of smoke. In the hangar deck below, the heat is now so intense that steel is beginning to glow red. The aluminum aircraft are melting, their magnesium components burning with a brilliant white flame that's nearly impossible to extinguish. More bombs cook off 250-pounders, 500-pounders, some of the 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs that were meant for Japanese ships. Each explosion feeds the fire, ruptures more fuel tanks, sets off more ammunition. Pharmacist's mate third-class Robert Doc Wassman is in the sick bay, 3 decks below the hangar, when he feels the first explosion through the soles of his feet. Before he can react, the second blast hits, and suddenly wounded men are pouring down the ladders, burned, bleeding, many in shock. Some have been flash burned so severely that their skin is hanging in sheets. Others are missing limbs, leaving trails of blood across the white linoleum. Within 2 minutes, Wassman has 30 casualties, then 50, then more than he can count. On the bridge, Captain Guerres grabs the rail to steady himself as another massive explosion rocks the ship. Through the windows, he can see his flight deck being consumed by fire. Smoke is boiling up in a black column visible for miles. His ship, his command, is dying beneath his feet, and it's been less than 3 minutes since the attack began. He turns to his officer of the deck. "Sound general quarters. All hands to..." The words are cut off by the most devastating explosion yet. A tiny TIM rocket has penetrated deep into the ship before detonating, and the blast ruptures the forward aviation fuel tanks. 50,000 gallons of gasoline pour into the bilges and ignite. The Franklin lurches violently to starboard as the internal explosion buckles the hull. Men on the flight deck are thrown from their feet. Some slide across the canted deck and over the side, falling 70 feet into the cold Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Taylor, still somehow alive on the flight deck, watches a wall of flame shoot up through the elevator shaft like a volcanic eruption. The blast is so powerful that it tears the remaining sections of the forward elevator completely off the ship and sends debris arcing through the sky. A piece of deck plating the size of a Buick tumbles end over end before splashing into the ocean 200 yards away. The Franklin is listing 7 degrees to starboard now, and the list is increasing. Below decks, in the engineering spaces, men can hear the groaning of stressed metal, the screech of bulkheads beginning to fail. The ship is taking on water from ruptured seams, and the fire has cut off access to the damage control stations. Nearly 400 men are already dead, vaporized or burned or killed by explosions. Another 300 are wounded, many mortally, and the fire is still spreading. Chaplain Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan is in his quarters when the first bomb hits. A former physics professor at Holy Cross College, the Jesuit priest has seen combat before the Franklin has been in the thick of the Pacific War for months, but nothing has prepared him for this. The entire ship shudders like a living thing in agony, and he can hear screams echoing through the passageways. He doesn't hesitate. Grabbing his helmet and life jacket, O'Callaghan rushes toward the ladder, leading up to the hangar deck. The companionway is already filling with smoke, thick, black, choking smoke that tastes of burning rubber and gasoline, and something worse, something organic. Men are stumbling down the ladder, their faces blackened, some sobbing, others silent with shock. O'Callaghan pushes against the tide, climbing upward into the inferno. When he emerges onto the hangar deck, he steps into hell. The space, normally a cavernous workshop larger than a football field, has become a crematorium. The overhead is invisible through the smoke and flames. Aircraft are burning so intensely that their metal frames are collapsing in on themselves. Ammunition is cooking off in a continuous crackle of small arms rounds. Bigger explosions boom periodically as bombs detonate, each one sending shrapnel ricocheting off the steel bulkheads. But what stops O'Callaghan cold are the men. Some are on fire, staggering blindly, beating at flames that won't go out. Others lie motionless in spreading pools of blood and aviation fuel. A few are trapped under fallen debris, screaming for help that may never come. The heat is so intense that O'Callaghan can feel his exposed skin beginning to blister. He starts pulling men from the wreckage, dragging them toward the relative safety of the starboard passageway. A young sailor, he can't be more than 19, is pinned under a collapsed wing section. O'Callaghan and 2 other men heave against the twisted aluminum, ignoring the heat that's searing their hands, until the sailor can crawl free. His legs are mangled, but he's alive. On the bridge, Captain Garris is facing an impossible decision. The ship is listing 14 degrees now, and the fire is completely out of control. Standard damage control procedures have failed catastrophically. The fire mains have been ruptured, water pressure is minimal or non-existent, and the fire is too large and too hot for the crew to approach with handheld extinguishers. More bombs are exploding every minute, some with enough force to punch holes in the Franklin's 3/4-inch armored deck. Commander Stephen Jerica appears at Garris's elbow, his face blackened with smoke. "Captain, we've lost all communication with the engineering spaces. Fire's spreading toward the forward magazines. If those go," he doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. The forward magazines contain hundreds of tons of bombs, rockets, and ammunition. If the fire reaches them, the Franklin won't just sink, she'll disintegrate in an explosion that will be visible from Kyushu. At 7:13 a.m., Just 6 minutes after the attack, Garrus gives the hardest order of his career. Pass the word. All hands topside. Prepare to abandon ship. The call goes out through the few communication circuits still functioning and is shouted down passageways by runners when the electrical systems fail. All hands topside. Abandon ship. This is not a drill. The response is immediate and chaotic. Men pour up from the lower decks, climbing ladders through smoke so thick they're moving by feel alone. Some emerge onto the flight deck and immediately throw themselves over the side, jumping 70 feet into the ocean to escape the inferno. Others cluster at the rail, paralyzed by fear or indecision. A few refuse to leave their stations, determined to keep fighting even as the ship dies around them. Ensign James Breen is trying to organize the evacuation from the starboard side when he sees something that makes his blood run cold. Men in the water are being pulled away from the ship by the current, but the destroyers circling the Franklin are too far away to pick them up quickly. Some of the swimmers are already struggling, pulled under by the weight of waterlogged clothes and heavy shoes. Others are wounded, leaving trails of blood that will certainly attract sharks. Lieutenant Donald Gary, the ship's first lieutenant and damage control officer, has been in the forward part of the ship trying to fight the fire when the abandoned ship order reaches him. He looks at the flames, at the smoke, at the twisted wreckage that was once an efficient fighting machine, and he makes a decision that will define the rest of his life. He's not leaving, not while men are still trapped below. Gary turns to the small group of sailors with him, maybe a dozen men, all looking to him for guidance. The engine rooms? He shouts over the roar of the fire. There are men down there who don't know we've been hit. They can't hear the abandoned ship order. We're going to get them out. One of the sailors, a kid named Henderson who looks terrified but determined, nods. Lead the way, sir. They plunge back into the smoke, heading down instead of up, while hundreds of their shipmates are fleeing in the opposite direction. The ladder is hot enough to burn their hands even through their gloves. The air is so thick with smoke that they're crawling on instinct, following Gary's lead as he navigates by memory through the labyrinth of passageways. 3 decks down, they find the door to the forward engine room. It's hot to the touch, the fire is close, maybe just on the other side of the next bulkhead. Gary wrenches it open and is nearly knocked over by the blast of superheated air. Inside, he can barely make out figures moving in the dim emergency lighting. Engine room crew, Gary shouts. We're abandoning ship. Follow me out, now. Chief Machinist's mate Raymond Silva turns from his station, his face a mask of shock. Abandoning? Sir, we still have power. We can... The flight deck is gone. Gary cuts him off. The hangar deck is on fire, bombs are cooking off, and the captain has given the order. We need to leave now. The reality crashes over Silva and his men. They've been sealed in their steel box, focused on keeping the turbines running, unaware that the world above them has ended. They grab what they can and follow Gary back toward the ladder, toward safety, toward life. But as they climb, another massive explosion rocks the Franklin. The blast is so powerful that it knocks men off the ladder. Gary feels the ship lurch violently, hears the screech of tearing metal somewhere close. When he reaches the hangar deck level, he sees that the explosion has collapsed part of the passageway they just came through. They made it out with seconds to spare. Anyone still below is trapped now, entombed in steel, as the fire spreads ever closer. By 7:30 a.m., more than 800 men have abandoned the Franklin. They're in the water, clinging to life rafts, floating debris, or just swimming, trying to stay alive until the destroyers can reach them. The ship they've left behind is a vision of apocalypse burning from bow to stern, listing heavily, trailing a pillar of black smoke that rises thousands of feet into the sky. Everyone from the greenest sailor to Captain Garrus himself believes they're watching the Franklin's death throes. No carrier has ever survived damage this catastrophic. The ship that wouldn't die is about to become the largest wartime loss in naval history. But 106 officers and men, including Lieutenant Gary, Commander Jurica, and Chaplain O'Callaghan, have made a different choice. They've stayed aboard, and against all reason, against all logic, they're about to attempt the impossible. They're going to save their ship. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taylor finds Captain Garris on the bridge, standing amid shattered glass and twisted metal, staring out at the burning flight deck with an expression carved from granite. The captain has stayed at his post even as most of his crew went over the side. Now he turns to Taylor, and in that moment, Taylor sees something shift in the older man's eyes, a transition from acceptance of death to defiant determination. "We're not losing this ship," Garris says, his voice cutting through the thunder of explosions. "Not while I'm still breathing." It's not an order. It's a statement of fact, delivered with such absolute conviction that Taylor feels something solidify in his own chest. He nods. "What do you need, sir?" "I need every man who stayed. Get them organized. I don't care if we only have 100 left. We're going to fight this fire." Taylor makes his way back down to the gallery deck, where he finds Commander Jurica already gathering survivors. There are perhaps 30 men here, damage control personnel, a few Marine guards, sailors who refused to abandon ship or couldn't make it to the rail before the routes were cut off. They're a ragtag group, many wounded, all exhausted, but they're still here. "Listen up," Jurica's voice carries despite the chaos. "The captain's not abandoning ship. That means we're not abandoning ship. We're going to save the Franklin." A few of the men exchange glances. One sailor, Seaman First Class William Hickey, speaks up, his voice raw from smoke inhalation. "Sir, with respect. How? The fire mains are gone, half the ship's on fire, and we've got maybe 100 guys left against an inferno. With whatever we've got," Jurica replies. "Buckets. Helmets. Our bare hands if we have to. The cruiser Santa Fe is coming alongside to help evacuate the wounded and bring over firefighting parties. Until then, we contain what we can and pray." On the hangar deck, Chaplain O'Callaghan has become the unlikely commander of a desperate firefighting effort. The priest has stripped off his clerical collar and is directing men to form a bucket brigade using anything that holds water, coffee cans, cooking pots, even shoes. It's absurd, almost laughable, trying to fight a petroleum fire that's consuming thousands of gallons of aviation fuel with buckets of seawater. But O'Callaghan understands something crucial. It's not about putting out the fire. It's about keeping these men focused, giving them purpose, preventing panic. "Keep it moving," he shouts, passing a bucket down the line. "We're not letting her go without a fight." A tremendous explosion tears through the hangar deck, another tiny Tim rocket detonating. The blast wave knocks half the bucket brigade off their feet. O'Callaghan is thrown backward, landing hard against a bulkhead. His ears are ringing, and he can taste blood in his mouth. But he forces himself up, retrieves his bucket, and gets back in line. "Come on," he shouts. "On your feet. We've got work to do." The men rise, one by one, and resume their futile but essential task. Below decks, Lieutenant Donald Gary has made his way to the after-engine room, where a handful of engineering personnel are still at their posts. Chief Machinist's mate Arthur Jones looks up in surprise as Gary appears through the smoke. "Lieutenant, we heard abandoned ship." "Belay that," Gary cuts him off. "Captain's staying. We're staying. Can you give us power?" Jones glances at his gauges. The Franklin's engineering plant is a marvel of redundancy. 4 separate engine rooms, each capable of independent operation. The forward sections are compromised, probably destroyed. But here in the aft machinery spaces, the turbines are still running. "We've got steam, sir. Port shaft is gone, took damage from an internal explosion, but the starboard shaft is intact. We can make turns for maybe 8 to 10 knots. Then we've got propulsion," Gary says, feeling the first spark of hope. And if we've got propulsion, we can maneuver. If we can maneuver, we can keep her into the wind. Keep the fire from spreading aft. It's a small thing, but in the catastrophe consuming the Franklin, small things matter. If they can control the ship's heading, they can use the wind to blow the flames away from the undamaged sections. It won't save them, but it might buy time. Gary makes his way back topside to report to the bridge, climbing through passages that are growing hotter by the minute. Twice he has to detour around sections that have become impassable, blocked by wreckage or filled with toxic smoke. When he finally reaches the bridge, he finds Captain Garris coordinating with the heavy cruiser USS Santa Fe, which has closed to within 50 yards of the Franklin's starboard side, an incredibly dangerous maneuver given the explosion still rocking the carrier. Captain Harold Fitz on the Santa Fe has made a gutsy decision. Despite the risk that a massive explosion could destroy both ships, he's bringing his cruiser alongside to evacuate the Franklin's wounded and provide firefighting support. It's seamanship of the highest order, threading an 11,000-ton warship through debris-filled waters, matching speed with a drifting, burning carrier, all while Japanese aircraft could return at any moment. At 7:52 a.m., the Santa Fe makes contact. Lines are thrown across the narrow gap between the two ships. The cruiser's crew begins rigging a breeches buoy, a canvas seat attached to a pulley system, to transfer the most critically wounded men. Doc Wassman and his overwhelmed medical team start sending stretcher cases across. Men with burns covering 80% of their bodies, sailors missing limbs, Marines with shrapnel wounds that should have been fatal but somehow weren't. Commander Jurica supervises the transfer, watching as burned and broken men are pulled across the gap between the ships. Each successful transfer is a small victory. Each life saved is a reason to keep fighting. The Santa Fe also sends across firefighting teams with portable pumps and hoses. It's not much a single cruiser's damage control. Parties can't stop the inferno consuming a fleet carrier, but it's something. More importantly, it's a lifeline. A connection to the rest of the fleet. Proof that they're not alone. On the bridge, Captain Garris receives word from the after engineering spaces. They have propulsion. His decision is immediate. Right standard rudder. Come to course 270. Make turns for 8 knots. The Franklin, her flight deck a twisted landscape of fire and wreckage, her hangar deck a furnace, her crew reduced to a skeleton force, begins to move under her own power. It's a crawl, barely faster than a walking pace, but she's moving. The Big Ben is not dead yet. Garris turns the ship into the wind, and the effect is immediate. The flames, which had been spreading aft toward the undamaged sections, are now blown forward over the sections already destroyed. It's not a solution, but it's a reprieve. Commander Jurica appears at Garris's side, his face a mask of soot and determination. Captain, we've got reports of men still trapped in the forward berthing compartments. The fires cut them off from the main escape routes. Garris closes his eyes for a moment, the weight of command crushing down on him. Men are dying below decks, trapped and helpless, while the fire creeps closer. But if he sends rescue parties forward, he's likely sending them to their deaths too. Send Lieutenant Gary, he says finally. If anyone can reach them, he can. But make it clear, this is volunteer only. No one is ordered into that inferno. Gary, told of the trapped men, doesn't hesitate. He gathers a team, 6 men, all volunteers, and they head forward once again, descending into the smoke and flames to find sailors who may already be dead. It's now 8:15 a.m. The Franklin has been burning for over an hour. More than 400 men are confirmed dead, hundreds more are wounded, and 800 have abandoned ship. The forward magazines packed with hundreds of tons of explosives are heating up as the fire creeps closer. Every expert would say the ship is doomed, but the 100 men still aboard have decided that expert opinion doesn't matter. They're going to save their ship, or die trying. And in the suffocating darkness of the forward berthing spaces, 40 men huddled in a steel compartment that's rapidly becoming an oven are about to learn that their shipmates haven't forgotten them. Lieutenant Donald Gary and his 6 volunteers stand at the entrance to a passageway that looks like the throat of a blast furnace. The bulkheads are glowing red in places, hot enough that Gary can feel the radiant heat from 6 feet away. Smoke rolls along the overhead in thick, oily waves. Somewhere beyond that darkness, 40 men are trapped in compartment C. 301L. The forward enlisted berthing space, sealed behind a watertight door they can't open from the inside because the locking mechanism has warped from the heat. "Sir," says machinist's mate second class Charles Nowak, one of the volunteers. "We go in there. We might not come back out." Gary looks at each man in turn. They're all young, none over 25, and all terrified. But they're still here. "I know," he says quietly. "Anyone wants to stay behind. No shame in it. You've already done more than anyone could ask." No one moves. No one leaves. "All right then." Gary pulls a wet rag over his nose and mouth. "Stay low. Stay close. And if I go down, you get yourselves out. That's an order." They enter the passageway on their hands and knees, where the air is slightly cooler and the smoke less dense. The deck plates are hot enough to burn through their gloves within seconds. Gary leads them forward, navigating by memory and by feel. One hand on the bulkhead to guide him through the choking darkness. Behind them, the way they came glows with a sullen orange light as the fire continues to spread. Ahead, everything is black except for occasional flashes when ammunition cooks off nearby. The sound is overwhelming, the roar of the fire, the groan of stressed metal, the sharp crack of exploding ordnance, and underneath it all, a sound that makes Gary's blood run cold. Men screaming. They find the door to C301L after 5 minutes that feel like 5 hours. Gary can hear pounding from the other side, fists striking steel in desperate, weakening rhythm. The locking wheel is jammed solid, warped by heat. He tries to turn it and burns his hands even through the gloves. "Nowak, Henderson crowbar. We pry it open." The 2 sailors wedge a steel pry bar into the door frame and throw their weight against it. Nothing. They try again, muscles straining, feet slipping on the hot deck. The door shifts a 1/4 inch, then another 1/4 inch. Men on the other side of the door are shouting now, their voices hoarse and desperate. "Keep pulling." Gary adds his weight to the bar. "We're getting you out. Keep pulling." The door suddenly gives way with a screech of tortured metal, and 40 men pour out like water from a burst dam. They're stumbling, gasping, many on the verge of collapse from heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation. The compartment they were trapped in had become an oven. The temperature had climbed past 130 degrees, and several men had already lost consciousness. "Move! Move!" Gary is shouting, organizing them, getting them turned around and headed aft. "Follow the bulkhead with your right hand. Stay low. Don't stop moving." But even as they're evacuating the trapped sailors, Gary realizes they have another problem. The passageway they used to get here is now completely engulfed in flames. The fire has spread faster than he anticipated, cutting off their escape route. 47 men, the 40 rescued sailors plus Gary's 7-man team, are now trapped themselves deep in the forward section of a ship that's burning from the inside out. Gary forces himself to think through the panic trying to claw its way up his throat. There has to be another way out. The Franklin is a maze of passages, ladders, and emergency exits. He just has to find one that's still passable. "This way." He leads them down a side passage, one deck up, feeling his way through the smoke. Behind him, men are coughing, choking, some crawling now because they can't stand. Seaman Henderson has thrown one of the weaker men over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, refusing to leave anyone behind. They find a ladder leading up to the gallery deck. Gary tests it. It's hot, but not unbearable. Up! Everyone up! Move! The climb is agonizing. The ladder is slick with condensation and blood. Men's hands slip on the rungs. One sailor falls, is caught by the man below him, and they both keep climbing. The smoke is worse here, so thick that Gary can't see his own hands in front of his face. He's climbing by feel, by faith, by sheer stubborn refusal to die in this steel coffin. And then, impossibly, he feels fresh air, cool wind on his face. He emerges onto the gallery deck, and even though it's still a scene of devastation, fires burning, wreckage everywhere, the acrid smell of explosives and burning flesh, it's the most beautiful thing he's ever seen because it means they made it out. All 47 men stumble into the open air. Several collapse immediately, their legs giving out. Doc Wassman's medical team rushes forward with water and emergency treatment for smoke inhalation. Gary leans against a bulkhead, coughing so hard he thinks his lungs might tear, and watches as the men he saved are carried toward the Santa Fe for evacuation. Commander Jerica finds him there 10 minutes later. Gary, that was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen. The captain wants you on the bridge. In a minute, Gary rasps. First, I need to check on something. He makes his way aft, toward the engine rooms, because he's realized something crucial. The fire is spreading, yes, but it's spreading in predictable ways, following fuel lines and ventilation ducts. If they can isolate those routes, seal the right bulkheads and shut the right valves, they might be able to contain the fire to the forward sections of the ship. It's a long shot. It's probably impossible. But an hour ago, everyone thought the Franklin was already sunk. On the flight deck, Chaplain O'Callaghan has taken on yet another impossible task. The bombs there are still dozens of them scattered across the deck, some partially detonated. Others just sitting there waiting to cook off need to be jettisoned before they explode. The problem is that they're too heavy to simply throw overboard, and too dangerous to approach with the fire raging nearby. O'Callaghan organizes teams to rig makeshift dollies from wreckage, using pieces of deck plating as rollers. They approach each bomb carefully, gingerly, knowing that any one of them could detonate at any moment and kill everyone nearby. Working together, sweating in the intense heat, they roll the first bomb to the deck edge and tip it over the side. It falls 70 feet and splashes into the Pacific. One down, dozens to go. A young sailor, barely 18 years old, his name tag reads, Morrison is helping O'Callaghan roll a 500-pounder when it happens. A secondary explosion from the hangar deck below sends a geyser of flame shooting up through a hole in the flight deck. The fire washes over Morrison, and suddenly the kid is screaming, beating at his clothes as they ignite. O'Callaghan doesn't think. He lunges forward and tackles Morrison, rolling him across the deck to smother the flames. His own hands are burning, he can smell his flesh cooking, but he keeps rolling until the fire is out. Morrison is badly burned but alive. O'Callaghan's hands are red and blistering, but he barely notices. There are more bombs to move, and the fire is getting closer. At 9:30 a.m., 2.5 hours after the attack, Captain Garris receives a report that makes his blood run cold. The fire has reached Hangar Deck Division 3, where the forward magazines are located. The temperature in the magazine spaces is climbing rapidly. At current rates, the explosives will reach their detonation point in less than 30 minutes. If those magazines blow, they'll take what's left of the Franklin with them, and probably the Santa Fe too. Hundreds of men, sailors who fought and bled and refused to give up, will die instantly. Garris has one option left, and it's almost as dangerous as letting the magazines explode. He turns to his gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Wassman, no relation to the pharmacist's mate. Can you flood the forward magazines? Wassman stares at him. Flooding the magazines means opening valves that will let thousands of tons of seawater pour into the Franklin's forward sections. It will increase the ship's list dramatically, possibly to the point where she capsizes, But if they don't flood the magazines? I can try, sir. But I'll need to get down there to manually open the valves. The electrical controls are gone. Then get down there, Garrus says. Take whoever you need, and Wassman don't die. That's an order. Wassman gathers 3 volunteers and descends once more into the Franklin's burning forward sections, racing against time and physics to flood the magazines before the fire turns his ship into a floating bomb. Above them, the Franklin continues to crawl through the water at 8 knots, her course steady into the wind, her handful of surviving crew fighting for every second of survival. The ship that wouldn't die is living up to her name. Lieutenant Commander Robert Wassman descends into what feels like the anteroom of hell itself. Each ladder takes him deeper into the Franklin's forward sections, where the temperature climbs with every step. The 3 men with him, gunner's mate First Class Andrew Lindstrom, seaman Philip Dadalow, and boatswain's mate Second Class George Sullivan, follow without hesitation, though Wassman can see the fear in their eyes. It mirrors his own. The magazine flooding station is located 4 decks below the hangar, adjacent to the forward bomb storage rooms. Under normal circumstances, it's a 5-minute walk from the bridge. Now, with passages blocked by fire and wreckage, detours necessary at every turn, and smoke so thick they're navigating blind, it might as well be on the other side of the world. They feel their way through a passageway that's pitch black except for the occasional flash of exploding ammunition. The deck beneath their feet vibrates constantly, sometimes from the ship's engines, struggling to maintain headway, sometimes from explosions, sometimes from the structural groan of steel being stressed beyond its design limits. Temperature's gotta be 140, maybe 150 degrees down here. Lindstrom gasps, his voice muffled by the wet rag over his face. Sir, are we even going to make it to the station? We make it or we die trying, Wassman replies. And there's no bravado in his voice, just simple acknowledgement of reality. Because if we don't flood those magazines, everyone on this ship dies anyway. They find the flooding station hatch after 15 minutes of groping through darkness. The wheel is scorching hot. Wassman can feel the heat through his gloves, but it turns. The hatch opens with a metallic shriek, and they stumble into a small compartment that houses the manual flood valve controls. The space is claustrophobic, barely large enough for 4 men, and the temperature is unbearable. The gauges on the bulkhead tell a terrifying story. The forward magazine spaces containing hundreds of tons of bombs, rockets, and ammunition are reading 168 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. The critical temperature, the point at which high explosives begin cooking off in an uncontrollable chain reaction, is around 200 degrees. They have maybe 20 minutes. Maybe. Wassman reaches for the first valve wheel. It's a massive thing, designed to control thousands of gallons of flooding water. Under normal circumstances, it would be operated by hydraulic pressure. Now, with all power lost to this section, it has to be turned by hand. And it's seized. Everyone on it, Wassman orders. On 3, 1, 2, 3. 4 men throw their weight against the valve wheel. It doesn't budge. The metal has expanded in the heat, jamming the mechanism. They try again, muscles straining, hands slipping despite their gloves. Nothing. Pry bar, Sullivan says. We need leverage. Dadalow pulls a steel bar from his belt, the same kind of tool that saved 40 men from the berthing compartment, and they wedge it into the valve wheel's spokes. Using the bar as a lever, they try once more. The valve moves, just a fraction of an inch, but it moves. They heave again, and slowly, agonizingly, the wheel begins to turn. After 30 seconds of sustained effort, they hear the blessed sound of rushing water. The flood system is opening. Seawater begins pouring into the forward magazines, thousands of gallons per minute, cooling the explosives before they can detonate. But there are 4 magazine spaces, and each one has its own flood valve. They've opened one. 3 to go. Wassman moves to the second valve, and they repeat the process. This one turns more easily, maybe the mechanism isn't as heat damaged, or maybe they're just getting better at this desperate work. Water begins flooding into magazine 2. The third valve refuses to budge at all. They strain against it until Lindstrom's hands are bleeding through his gloves, until Sullivan collapses against the bulkhead from heat exhaustion, until Wassman feels consciousness starting to slip away. But the valve won't turn. "We can't get it," Wassman finally admits, the words tasting like defeat. "But we've flooded 2 of the 4 magazines." "Maybe that's enough." "Sir," Dattilo says quietly, "magazine 3 is the big one. That's where they stored the tiny Tims, the 2,000-pound armor piercers, the whole forward ordnance load. If that one goes, he doesn't finish. He doesn't need to. If magazine 3 detonates, the explosion will be measured in kilotons. The Franklin will be obliterated. The Santa Fe, still alongside, will be destroyed. Men will die by the hundreds." Wassman looks at the stubborn valve, at his exhausted men, at the temperature gauge that continues to climb despite their efforts. 172 degrees now. "They're running out of time. Sullivan, Dattilo, get topside. Report to the captain what we've accomplished. Lindstrom, you're with me. We're not leaving this valve." "Sir," Sullivan starts to protest. "That's an order. Get out while you still can. And if we don't make it." Wassman pauses, thinking of his wife back in San Diego, his 2 kids, who are going to grow up without a father. Sullivan and Dattilo climb back up the ladder, and then it's just Wassman and Lindstrom in the suffocating heat, working the valve. They try everything, hitting it with hammers to break loose the corrosion, heating it further with a cutting torch in hopes of expanding the metal differently, even pouring their precious drinking water over it to create thermal shock. Nothing works. "Sir," Lindstrom says, his voice hoarse from heat and smoke, "we've been down here almost 40 minutes. We don't have much time left before we're too weak to climb out." Wassman knows he's right. The heat is crushing. His vision is starting to narrow, dark spots dancing at the edges. His hands are shaking uncontrollably, but the valve, that stubborn, critical valve, remains closed. Then, without warning, an explosion rocks the compartment. Not close, but near enough to feel. The light's emergency battle lanterns that had been their only illumination go out. For a moment, Wassman and Lindstrom are in absolute darkness, and Wassman thinks, "This is it. This is how we die." But the Franklin doesn't explode. The darkness is just darkness, not the prelude to oblivion. And in that darkness, Wassman makes his peace with what comes next. "One more try," he says. "On 3. They put everything they have left into the valve wheel. Every ounce of strength, every moment of training, every reason they joined the Navy and went to war and stayed aboard a burning ship when everyone else was jumping over the side. They pour it all into this single, desperate effort. The valve moves. It grinds, screeches, protests with the sound of tortured metal, but it moves. They keep turning, and suddenly it's easier, the mechanism freed from whatever was binding it. Water begins to rush into magazine 3, and the temperature gauge, still visible in the faint glow from a distant fire, stops climbing, holds steady, begins to drop. 172 degrees, 170, 165. "We did it," Lindstrom whispers, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, we actually did it." Wassman slumps against the bulkhead, every muscle in his body trembling. "Fourth valve," he manages to say. "We need to—" "Sir, the 4th magazine was mostly empty. They were drawing down the load before the attack. It's not critical." Lindstrom helps Wassman to his feet. "But we are. We need to get out of here before we pass out and become someone else's rescue mission." The climb back up is a nightmare. Wassman's legs keep giving out, and he has to stop every few rungs to rest. Twice, Lindstrom has to physically pull him up to the next deck. The smoke is thicker now, the fire has spread into sections that were clear an hour ago, and they have to detour 3 times to find passable routes. When they finally emerge onto the gallery deck, Commander Jurica is waiting with water and medical personnel. Wassman collapses onto a stretcher, and the last thing he sees before losing consciousness is the temperature gauge from the magazine flooding station. Someone has brought it up and mounted it where the bridge crew can see it. Magazine 1, 145 degrees and falling. Magazine 2, 152 degrees and falling. Magazine 3, 161 degrees and falling. The Franklin's forward magazines, the ticking time bomb at the heart of the ship, have been neutralized. The ship that wouldn't die just dodged her most lethal bullet yet. On the bridge, Captain Garris receives the report and allows himself a moment of something that might almost be called hope. It's 10:45 a.m. The Franklin has been burning for 3.5 hours. She's still on fire, still listing 15 degrees to starboard, still taking on water, still fundamentally crippled. But she hasn't exploded. She hasn't sunk, and somehow, impossibly, she's still making headway at 8 knots, crawling away from the Japanese coastline and toward the relative safety of the open Pacific. "Get me a damage assessment," Garris orders. "I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. And someone find Lieutenant Gary. I need him on the bridge." Because while they've stopped the immediate catastrophe, the fire is still burning. And a new problem is emerging. The Franklin is listing so heavily that she might capsize. The water flooding into the damaged forward sections is weighing down the bow, and without power to the pumps, there's no way to remove it. The fight for survival is far from over. In fact, in many ways, the hardest part is just beginning. Lieutenant Donald Gary stands in what used to be the Franklin's damage control central, surveying a hand-drawn schematic of the ship that looks like a medical chart for a dying patient. Red X's mark sections that are completely destroyed. Orange shading indicates areas on fire. Blue marks flooding. The diagram is more red and orange than anything else. "Give it to me straight," Captain Garris says, appearing beside him. The captain's face is haggard, lined with exhaustion and soot, but his eyes are still sharp. "Can we save her?" Gary doesn't answer immediately. He's calculating in his head water weight, structural integrity, the rate of flooding versus the fire's spread. The numbers aren't good. "Sir, we're listing 15 degrees to starboard. We've got flooding in the forward sections from the magazine cooling, flooding amidships from ruptured seams, and the fire has compromised structural bulkheads on 3 decks. The flight deck is twisted, some sections are warped up to 3 feet out of true. I didn't ask for a damage report, Lieutenant. I asked if we can save her." Gary meets his captain's eyes. "If we can counter the list, stop the flooding, and control the fire. Maybe. But sir, we'd need a miracle. We've got about 100 men left aboard. Most of our damage control equipment is destroyed or inaccessible. And we're still 50 miles from the nearest friendly port, which happens to be Ulithi. 4 days, steaming away, even if we had full power. Then we'll take our miracle and make it last 4 days." Garris turns to address the small group of officers who've gathered: Commander Jurica, the ship's executive officer, Commander Joseph Taylor, engineering officer, Commander Hale, and a handful of department heads. "Gentlemen, here's where we stand. The fire is contained to the forward sections, but not extinguished. We've neutralized the magazine threat. We have propulsion limited, but functional. Our list is stable, but critical. The Santa Fe is still alongside, providing fire support and taking off our wounded." He pauses, and in that pause, every man present understands that the next words will determine whether they're fighting for survival or just delaying the inevitable. "We're going to save this ship," Garris continues. "Not because command has ordered it, not because it's tactically sound, but because 832 of our shipmates have already died on her decks, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let the ocean have her after everything we've been through. Questions? There's a moment of silence. Then Commander Hale speaks up. Captain, the list. If it increases past 20 degrees, we're going to lose her. The water trapped in the forward sections will shift, we'll go past our stability point, and she'll roll. Then we don't let it get past 20 degrees. What do we need? Counter-flooding, Gary says immediately. We deliberately flood compartments on the port side to balance out the starboard list. It'll make the ship heavier, sink her lower in the water, but it'll stop the roll. Do it, Gara's orders. What else? We need to jettison weight from the starboard side, Jurica adds. Everything that's not essential. Vehicles, equipment, wreckage from the flight deck. Get it over the side. Reduce the starboard weight. Already happening, Gara says. Chaplain O'Callaghan has teams working on it now. What about the fire? Commander Taylor points to the diagram. Sir, the fire is actually working in our favor in one respect. It's creating an updraft that's venting smoke and heat through the holes in the flight deck. As long as we keep the ship pointed into the wind, the flames are being blown forward, over sections already destroyed. But if we lose headway, if we lose the ability to maneuver, then the fire spreads aft and we lose everything. Garrus nods. Chief Engineer, I need that starboard shaft running. I don't care if we're only making 5 knots, I need steerage. Aye, sir. But Captain, I need to tell you we've got fires in the forward engineering spaces. Not in the engine room itself, but close. If those fires reach the fuel bunkers, everyone in the compartment understands what that means. The Franklin's fuel oil tanks contain thousands of tons of thick, black petroleum. If that ignites, it'll burn for days, possibly weeks, with a heat so intense that no firefighting effort could stop it. The ship would become a floating funeral pyre. Then we keep the fire away from the fuel bunkers. Garrus says flatly. Seal every bulkhead between the fire and the engineering spaces. Vent the fuel lines. Do whatever it takes. We didn't flood the magazines just to have the ship burn from the inside out. Lieutenant Donald Gary stands at the entrance to a passageway that's literally glowing with heat. The aviation fuel tank is located 3 compartments forward, behind 2 watertight doors, and through a section of the ship where the temperature is well over 200 degrees. The metal bulkheads are cherry red in places, radiating heat like a furnace. And somewhere beyond that inferno, 20,000 gallons of gasoline are heating up, minute by minute, degree by degree, approaching the point where they'll explode with enough force to tear open the Franklin's hull. We need to vent that tank, Gary says, more to himself than to the 5 men with him, machinist's mate Nowak, boatswain's mate Sullivan, who refused to stay behind after the magazine flooding, and 3 sailors whose names Gary doesn't even know but who volunteered anyway. If we can open the relief valves, release the pressure, and let the fumes escape in a controlled manner, we might prevent a catastrophic explosion. Might, Nowak repeats. Sir, no disrespect, but that's a hell of a long shot. You got a better idea? Nowak shakes his head. No, sir. But I wanted to make sure we're all clear on the odds before we walk into that. Gary looks at each man. They're exhausted, burned, battered, pushed past any reasonable limit of human endurance. They should be in sick bay, or on the Santa Fe receiving medical treatment, or anywhere except here, about to enter a compartment that might explode at any second. Last chance to back out, he says quietly. No one will think less of you. No one moves. All right then. Wet rags over your faces. Stay low. If I give the order to retreat, you don't argue. You don't hesitate, you run like hell. Understood? Understood, sir. They enter the passage on hands and knees. The deck is so hot that Gary can feel it through his gloves, through his pants, through everything. His lungs are burning with each breath, despite the wet rag over his face. The smoke is so thick he can't see the man crawling behind him, can only hear the rasp of breathing and the scrape of bodies against hot steel. They reach the first watertight door. Gary tests the handle. It's scorching, but he forces himself to grip it and turn. The door swings open, and a wall of heat hits them like a physical blow. Inside, the compartment is an oven. The paint has burned off the bulkheads. Everything metal glows with a dull red luminescence. Jesus Christ! Someone whispers behind him, but they keep moving, because stopping means dying, and dying means the fuel tank explodes anyway. They crawl through the first compartment and reach the second door. This one is even hotter. When Gary touches the handle, his glove starts to smolder. Sullivan, pry bar. We can't turn this by hand. They wedge the bar into the door mechanism and force it open. Beyond is the fuel tank compartment, a narrow space dominated by a cylindrical tank 10 feet in diameter and 20 feet long. The tank itself is intact, but Gary can see stress fractures in the welds, and the relief valve on top is closed tight, sealed by corrosion and heat. That valve, a simple mechanical fitting designed to release excess pressure, is all that stands between them and disaster. If they can open it, the built-up fumes will vent harmlessly. If they can't, Gary doesn't let himself think about that. Nowak, with me, everyone else, back behind that door. If this goes wrong, no sense in all of us dying. Nowak doesn't argue, though Gary can see the fear in his eyes. They approach the tank together, and the heat is so intense that Gary's vision starts to blur. His skin feels like it's crisping. Every breath is agony. The relief valve is 12 feet off the deck, at the top of the tank. They need to climb a maintenance ladder welded to the tank's side, a ladder that's glowing red hot. We wrap our hands, Gary says, tearing strips from his already ruined shirt. Thick as possible. It won't help much, but it's something. They wrap their hands until they look like they're wearing bandages. Then Gary starts to climb. The first rung burns through the fabric instantly. Pain shoots through his palms, but he keeps climbing. Behind him, Nowak follows. At the top, Gary can see the relief valve, a wheel about 10 inches in diameter, covered in rust and corrosion. He reaches for it, and even through the wrappings, the heat is unbearable. His hands are burning. He can smell his own flesh cooking. But he grips the wheel and tries to turn it. It doesn't move. Nowak. Gary's voice is a rasp. Both of us. Together. Nowak reaches the top of the ladder and adds his hands to the wheel. They pull with everything they have left. Every ounce of strength. Every molecule of willpower. Gary's hands are screaming in agony. He can feel blisters forming, popping, forming again. Blood is seeping through the fabric wrappings. The wheel moves, just a fraction of an inch. But it moves. They pull harder. And suddenly it's turning, spinning free. And Gary hears the blessed hiss of escaping gas. Fumes pour out of the relief valve, venting into the compartment in a visible stream. The smell is overwhelming. Pure gasoline vapor. Thick and heavy. But it's escaping. Not exploding. Down, Gary shouts. Get down before those fumes find an ignition source. They scramble down the ladder, half falling, hands too burned to properly grip the rungs. They hit the deck and crawl toward the door, toward the other compartment, putting distance between themselves and the venting fumes. Behind them, the tank continues to hiss, releasing its deadly pressure in a controlled release instead of a catastrophic explosion. They make it back through both watertight doors and collapse in a passageway that seems almost cool by comparison, though it's still well over 120 degrees. Gary looks at his hands and immediately wishes he hadn't. They're red and black, the skin hanging in strips, burned to the 3rd degree in places. Nowak's hands are just as bad. Sullivan is there with water, pouring it over their hands. But Gary barely feels it. The adrenaline is wearing off, and the pain is becoming all-consuming. Doc Wassman's medical team arrives. Someone must have radioed ahead, and they start wrapping burns, injecting morphine, getting Gary and Nowak onto stretchers. The tank? Gary manages to ask through gritted teeth. Is it still venting? No. Yes, sir, Sullivan reports. We've got fire parties standing by with foam extinguishers in case the fumes ignite, but so far it's just venting. You did it, Lieutenant. You saved the ship. Again. Gary wants to say something heroic, something inspiring. But all that comes out is, good. That's good. Then, the morphine takes hold, and the world fades to gray. On the bridge, Captain Garris receives the report about the fuel tank with visible relief. It's 1:15 p.m. Now. 6 hours since the attack. 6 hours of continuous crisis, one disaster after another, each one threatening to be the final blow that sends the Franklin to the bottom. But they're still floating, still burning, yes, still damaged beyond anything Garris has ever seen a ship survive, but still afloat, still making headway, still fighting. Commander Jurica appears with an updated casualty report, and the numbers are staggering. 724 men confirmed dead, 265 wounded, more than 800 evacuated to the Santa Fe and other screening ships. Of the Franklin's original complement of 2,600 men, fewer than 110 remain aboard, and those 110 men have saved the ship. Sir, Jurica says quietly, I've been in the Navy 20 years. I've seen ships survive kamikaze strikes, torpedo hits, even magazine explosions. But this, Captain, the Franklin should be on the bottom right now. By every rule of engineering and physics and common sense, she should have sunk hours ago. Garris looks out at his ruined flight deck, at the smoke still billowing from the forward sections, at the heavy list that makes the ship look like she's perpetually on the verge of rolling over. Should have, he agrees, but didn't. And won't. Not on my watch. A lookout shouts from the wing of the bridge. Ship approaching from astern. Looks like. Sir. It's the Pittsburgh. The heavy cruiser USS Pittsburgh, all 13,000 tons of her, is closing on the Franklin's port side. She's flying signal flags that spell out a message every sailor aboard the Franklin can read. Ready to assist. Captain John Gingrich on the Pittsburgh has brought his ship alongside to provide more than just assistance. He's brought hope. The Pittsburgh carries fresh firefighting equipment, medical supplies, additional pumps, and most importantly, a heavy-duty towing cable. If the Franklin's engines fail, if she loses the ability to steam under her own power, the Pittsburgh can tow her all the way to Ulithi. But accepting a tow means admitting they can't save themselves. It means giving up, even temporarily, the independence that's kept them alive this long. Garris makes his decision. Signal to Pittsburgh, standing by to receive tow if needed. For now we steam under own power, grateful for support. It's pride, maybe, or stubbornness. But the Franklin has made it this far on guts and determination, and the refusal of 100 men to accept the inevitable. Garris isn't going to give that up unless he absolutely has to. By 3 p.m., 8 hours after the attack, the situation has stabilized into something that might almost be called controllable. The fires are still burning but contained to specific sections. The list is holding steady at 16 degrees. The counter-flooding is working. The magazines are cool. The fuel tank is venting safely. The ship is making 6 knots toward Ulithi, now just 3 days away if nothing else goes wrong. Of course, on the Franklin, something else always goes wrong. As the tropical sun begins its descent toward the horizon, painting the Pacific in shades of orange and red that eerily mirror the flames still consuming the Franklin's forward sections. Captain Garris faces a new and insidious enemy: exhaustion. The men who've kept the ship alive for 8 hours straight are running on fumes. Commander Jurica is asleep on his feet, literally swaying at his post on the bridge before Garris orders him to get 2 hours of rest. The sailors fighting the fires move like zombies, their reactions slow, their judgment impaired by fatigue and smoke inhalation. Even Garris himself can feel consciousness slipping away at the edges, his mind struggling to process information that should be simple. But they can't stop. Not now. Not with night coming. Mr. Taylor, Garris addresses his executive officer, I need a watch rotation. Every man gets 4 hours of rest in the next 12, no exceptions. I don't care if we're down to 20 men on duty at any given time, better 20 alert men than 100 walking dead. Taylor nods, already making notes. Including you, sir? Especially me. I'm no good to this ship if I collapse from exhaustion. As darkness falls, the Franklin becomes a ghost ship sliding through black waters. Her running lights are out, either destroyed or deliberately darkened to avoid attracting Japanese submarines. The only illumination comes from the fires still burning in her forward sections, casting flickering orange light across the twisted wreckage of the flight deck. From a distance, she must look like a floating funeral pyre, a dying ship making its final voyage. But appearances are deceiving. In the after-engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Silva and his skeleton crew have coaxed the remaining boilers into something approaching stable operation. The starboard shaft is still turning, still pushing the Franklin through the water at 6 knots. Silva's hands are burned, his face is blackened with soot, and he hasn't eaten in 12 hours. But he stays at his post, monitoring gauges, adjusting fuel flow, keeping the heart of the ship beating. Chief, one of his firemen says quietly, we're down to 30% fuel. At this rate, we'll run dry before we reach Ulithi. Silva does the math in his head. They're making 6 knots. Ulithi is approximately 720 nautical miles away. That's 120 hours of steaming 5 days. With 30% fuel remaining, they have maybe 48 hours before the tanks run dry. Then we'll get towed the last 3 days, Silva says with more confidence than he feels. The Pittsburgh's right there. We're not sinking, son. We're just taking the scenic route home. On the flight deck, Chaplain O'Callaghan has organized the night watch into firefighting teams and wreckage-clearing crews. Working by the light of the flames and a few functioning battle lanterns, they continue the exhausting work of jettisoning destroyed aircraft and unexploded ordnance. Every piece of metal they throw over the side is weight that helps stabilize the ship, margin that keeps them afloat. O'Callaghan himself is in rough shape. His hands are so badly burned that he can barely grip anything. His face is red and blistered from repeated exposure to flames. His cassock is gone, torn up for bandages and firefighting rags hours ago. But he moves among the men, offering encouragement, helping where he can, and above all, refusing to let morale collapse into despair. Father, Seaman Morrison asks during a brief rest break, do you think we're going to make it? O'Callaghan looks at the young sailor, barely 18, burned, exhausted, scared. He thinks about lying, about offering empty reassurances. But these men deserve better than that. I think, he says carefully, that we've survived things today that should have killed us a dozen times over. The bombs, the fires, the explosions, the magazines. Every hour we're still afloat is a miracle. So yes, son, I think we're going to make it. Not because it's probable or logical, but because God doesn't send this many miracles just to let us sink in sight of salvation. It's not theology that would pass muster at Holy Cross, but it's what Morrison needs to hear. The young sailor nods, picks up his bucket, and gets back to work. At 2,100 hours, 9 p.m. 14 hours after the attack, The Franklin experiences what should be a minor incident, but nearly becomes catastrophic. One of the fire parties, working in the semi-darkness, accidentally opens a door to a compartment that's been sealed since the attack. The compartment is filled with smoke and superheated gases that have been building pressure for hours. When the door opens, the sudden influx of oxygen creates a backdraft, an explosive fireball that tears through the passageway. 3 men are caught in the blast. 2 are thrown clear with flash burns. The third, boatswain's mate second class, George Sullivan, the same Sullivan who volunteered for both the magazine flooding and the fuel tank venting, takes the full force of the explosion. Doc Wassman's medical team reaches him within 2 minutes, but there's nothing they can do. Sullivan's burns cover 90% of his body. He's unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. They carry him to the makeshift sick bay, lay him on a stretcher, and inject morphine to ease his pain. He dies at 2,130 hours, the 725th casualty of the Franklin's nightmare day. His death hits the crew hard. Sullivan had become a symbol of their survival, the man who kept volunteering, who kept going back into the fire, who seemed indestructible. If he could die, after everything he'd survived, then any of them could die. The invincibility they'd felt, the sense that they were somehow charmed, evaporates. Commander Jurica finds Captain Garris alone on the bridge wing, staring at the dark ocean. "Sir? About Sullivan." "I know." Garris cuts him off. His voice is rough. "He saved this ship 3 times today, and we couldn't save him. Sir, if he hadn't opened those valves, hadn't helped vent that fuel tank, we'd all be dead. His sacrifice wasn't a sacrifice," Garris says sharply. "He didn't volunteer to die. He volunteered to live, to help his shipmates live, to save his ship. Don't turn him into some kind of martyr. He was a sailor doing his duty, and he deserved better than to die from a freak accident 14 hours after surviving hell itself." They stand in silence for a moment. 2 exhausted men, carrying the weight of 725 dead sailors, and the responsibility for 110 who are still alive. "Sir," Jurica says finally, "the men are asking about a burial at sea. For Sullivan and the others we've recovered." Garris closes his eyes. In the chaos of fighting for survival, there hasn't been time to properly deal with the dead. Bodies have been moved to the forward deck, covered with canvas, awaiting burial. It's ghoulish, undignified, wrong in every way, but there's been no choice. Tomorrow morning, Garris decides, sunrise, we'll give them a proper send-off. Pass the word, any man who can be spared from his duties is to attend. These men earned that much. As midnight approaches, marking 15 hours since the attack, Lieutenant Gary wakes in the makeshift sick bay. His hands are wrapped in so many bandages he looks like he's wearing boxing gloves, and the morphine has worn off enough that the pain is back, a searing, constant agony that makes him want to scream. A pharmacist's mate sees him stirring and comes over with more morphine. But Gary waves him off with a clumsy gesture. "No. Need to stay alert." The ship is still afloat, sir," the corpsman says gently. "Thanks to you. You're done for tonight." Doctor's orders. Not a doctor on this ship anymore, Gary manages through gritted teeth. The Franklin's senior medical officer was killed in the initial attack. Just corpsman and a priest playing doctor. Then priest's orders. "Father O'Callahan checked on you an hour ago, said you've done enough for one day." Gary wants to argue, but his body has other ideas. The pain, the exhaustion, the accumulated trauma of the longest day of his life, it all crashes down on him at once. His eyes close despite his best efforts to keep them open. "Wake me if," he mumbles. "If anything important." He's asleep before he can finish the sentence. On the bridge, Captain Garris maintains his watch as the Franklin limps through the darkness. Behind them, the Pittsburgh keeps station, a silent guardian ready to assist if needed. Around them, the Pacific is vast and empty and indifferent to their struggle. The fires in the forward sections are finally beginning to die down, not from firefighting efforts, but simply because there's nothing left to burn. 16 hours of uncontrolled burning has consumed everything combustible in the Franklin's forward third. What remains is twisted metal, collapsed bulkheads, and the charred remains of what was once the most powerful weapons platform in the Pacific Fleet. But the engineering spaces are intact. The after magazines are secure. The rudder responds to commands. And most importantly, the ship is still making way, still heading east, still putting distance between herself and the Japanese home islands. At 0200 hours 2 a.m., 19 hours after the attack, Garris finally allows himself to be relieved. He stumbles to his sea cabin, collapses onto his bunk fully dressed, and falls into an exhausted sleep plagued by nightmares of fire and explosions, and the faces of 725 dead men. Commander Taylor takes the watch, and the Franklin sails on through the darkness. The night is far from over, and tomorrow will bring new challenges. But for now, in this moment, the ship that wouldn't die has survived another day, and that, more than anything, is enough. The first rays of sunlight break over the Pacific horizon at 0547 hours, on March 20th, 1945, 23 hours after the Japanese attack. The light reveals the full extent of the Franklin's wounds in brutal detail. The forward flight deck looks like it's been attacked by a giant with a can opener. Massive holes gape where bombs exploded through the steel plating. The forward elevator is gone, leaving a rectangular pit that drops straight through to the hangar deck below. What aircraft remain are burned-out husks, their aluminum frames melted into grotesque sculptures. The island superstructure is pockmarked with shrapnel damage and streaked with soot. But she's still afloat, still moving, still fighting. Captain Garris returns to the bridge after 4 hours of fitful sleep, looking like he's aged a decade overnight. His eyes are bloodshot, his face lined with exhaustion, but his jaw is set with determination. Today, they're going to bury their dead. And then they're going to continue the impossible task of getting the ship home. At 0600 hours, the word is passed. All hands not on essential watch. Lay to the fantail for burial services. 40 men gather at the stern of the ship, barely a third of those still aboard, but it's all they can spare. The rest are still fighting fires, manning the engine rooms, or too wounded to move. Chaplain O'Callaghan stands at the rail, his burned hands wrapped in fresh bandages, a borrowed Bible open before him. Before him, arranged in solemn rows under canvas shrouds, weighted with 5-inch shells, are 23 bodies, the men who could be recovered and identified from the carnage. Sullivan is among them. So are aviation ordnanceman Blanchard, who was arming aircraft when the first bomb hit, and machinist's mate Dice, who was standing near the explosion that started everything. 702 more men are still aboard the Franklin, but they'll never receive proper burial. They're entombed in the wreckage, scattered in pieces too small to recover, or vaporized in explosions that left nothing behind. For them, the ship itself is their grave. O'Callaghan's voice is hoarse as he begins the service. Unto Almighty God we commend the souls of our brothers departed, and we commit their bodies to the deep. The traditional words of the naval burial service, spoken over countless sailors throughout history, take on new weight here. These men didn't die in clean combat, struck down by enemy guns in a fair fight. They died in fire and explosion and chaos, many of them never even seeing the enemy that killed them. In sure and certain hope of the resurrection unto eternal life through our Lord Jesus Christ. One by one, the canvas-wrapped bodies are lifted to the rail. A Marine honor guard, Their dress uniforms replaced by work dungarees and K-pop life jackets renders a final salute. Then each body slides over the side, disappearing into the Pacific depths with barely a splash. Boatswain's mate second class George Sullivan goes last. As his body disappears beneath the waves, Seaman Morrison, standing with tears streaming down his burned face, whispers, "Fair winds and following seas, George. You saved us all." The service ends with a bugler, Seaman First Class James Denton, who learned the instrument in high school and never expected to use it like this, playing taps. The mournful notes drift across the water, and for just a moment, the war seems very far away. Then the moment passes, and they return to work. By 0800 hours, the Franklin has been burning for 25 hours straight, and the crew has achieved something remarkable. They've stopped the fire from spreading. Its not-out sections of the forward hangar deck are still smoldering, and occasional flare-ups occur when pockets of fuel or hydraulic fluid ignite. But the uncontrolled conflagration that threatened to consume the entire ship has been beaten back to isolated hot spots. Lieutenant Gary, awake despite his injuries and refusing to stay in sick bay, coordinates the final push to extinguish the remaining fires. His hands are too damaged to do physical work, so he directs teams by voice, pointing with his bandaged hands like a conductor, directing an orchestra of destruction and salvation. Team 3. There's still smoke coming from the forward port sponson. Get foam on it. Team 5. I need you checking for hot spots in the gallery deck. Use thermal probes. Don't just rely on visual. Team 7. Sir, interrupts Chief Silva, who's emerged from the engine room to check on the fire situation. You should be resting. Those hands will heal or they won't. Gary cuts him off. But if this ship sinks because I was lying in sick bay while fires spread, my hands won't matter much. Now, were you going to tell me something about the engines, Chief? Silva grins despite himself. Yes, sir. We're down to 20% fuel. At current consumption, we've got maybe 30 hours left. After that, we're dead in the water, and the Pittsburgh will have to tow us. Gary does the math. 30 hours at 6 knots is 180 nautical miles. They're still 650 miles from Ulithi. They're going to run out of fuel long before they reach safety. Can we reduce speed? Stretch the fuel? We're already at minimum steerage speed, sir. Go any slower and we lose the ability to maneuver. Wind and current will push us around. And with our list, we need to maintain precise heading to keep stable. Gary nods slowly. Then we make it 30 hours, and after that, we trust the Pittsburgh. Worse things have happened to us in the last day. It's dark humor, but it gets a chuckle from Silva. When you've survived what they've survived, running out of fuel seems almost quaint by comparison. At 1,000 hours, Captain Garris receives a radio message that brings the first genuine smile to his face in 24 hours. It's from Admiral Mitcher aboard the Bunker Hill. To Franklin X, your performance is beyond all expectations. Ex-Navy Department informed of your survival. X-Nation. Watching X bring her home. Captain X. Garris has the message posted throughout the ship, and the effect is immediate. Men who were moving like zombies find renewed energy. Sailors who were ready to collapse push through for another hour, another watch, another impossible task. Because now it's not just about survival. It's about proving something. It's about showing the world, the Navy, the Japanese, and themselves that the Franklin cannot be killed. The ship that wouldn't die has become a symbol, and symbols don't quit. By 1400 hours, 30 hours after the attack, the transformation is remarkable. The fires are out. Actually, genuinely, completely out. Smoke still rises from cooled wreckage, and some sections of the ship are still hot enough to burn exposed skin, but there are no more active flames. The fire that consumed the Franklin for more than a day has finally been defeated. The damage control parties collapse in exhaustion, many of them crying from relief and release. They've fought fire for 30 consecutive hours, with only brief breaks for water and medical attention. Their hands are burned, their lungs are damaged from smoke inhalation, their bodies are pushed past any reasonable limit. But they won. Commander Jurica finds Captain Garris on the bridge and renders a formal report. Captain, all fires are extinguished. Damage control teams are securing hot spots and checking for reflash potential. But the primary fire emergency is over. Garris grips the rail of the bridge and lets out a breath he feels like he's been holding for 30 hours. Well done, Commander. Pass the word to all hands, well done. Now let's get this ship home. But home is still 620 miles away, and the Franklin is barely crawling. Her list is stable but pronounced. Her fuel is running critically low. Her forward section is a twisted wreck. And worst of all, she's utterly defenseless. With her aircraft destroyed, her gun directors damaged, and most of her anti-aircraft batteries out of commission, she's a sitting duck if Japanese aircraft find her again. As if to emphasize this vulnerability, radar on the Pittsburgh picks up unidentified aircraft at 1,430 hours. The contact is bearing 270 degrees, range 40 miles, altitude 12,000 feet, 3 aircraft, possibly Japanese bombers. Garris doesn't hesitate. Signal to Pittsburgh, engage hostile aircraft. Franklin unable to defend. The cruiser's anti-aircraft batteries track the approaching contacts. Every sailor aboard the Franklin watches the sky, helpless, waiting to see if they're about to endure a second attack that they absolutely cannot survive. The aircraft close to 30 miles, 25, 20. Then the Pittsburgh's radar operator makes a correction. Contact identified as friendly. 3 Hellcats. From WASP. There are Cap. The collective relief is palpable. Those Hellcat fighters, combat air patrol, sent by the carrier WASP to protect the damaged Franklin circle overhead like guardian angels. As long as they're there, the Franklin is safe from air attack. But as the tropical sun begins its descent on March 20th, marking the end of the Franklin's second day of survival, a new problem emerges. The weather is changing. Dark clouds are building on the western horizon, and the barometer is dropping. A storm is coming, and the Franklin, listing, low in the water, barely making headway, is in no condition to weather heavy seas. The storm hits at 2,200 hours 10 p.m. on March 20th, 39 hours after the attack. It arrives with the suddenness that only Pacific weather can produce, transforming calm seas into churning chaos in less than 30 minutes. The first raindrops hit the Franklin's ruined flight deck like bullets, each one hissing against metal that's still warm from the fires. Then, the wind picks up, 20 knots, 30, 40, driving the rain horizontally across the ship. Waves that were gentle 2-foot swells suddenly build to 8 feet, then 10, then 12, slamming into the Franklin's starboard side and sending spray cascading over her reduced freeboard. On the bridge, Captain Garris watches the barometer continue its plunge and feels his stomach drop with it. The Franklin is designed to handle heavy seas. Carriers are among the most seaworthy vessels ever built, but that design assumes a ship that's intact, properly balanced, and under full power. The Franklin is none of those things. Officer of the deck, what's our heading? Garris demands. 270, sir. Due west, into the wind and seas. Maintain that heading. If we let ourselves get pushed beam to these waves, we'll roll. It's a simple statement of physics. The Franklin is already listing 16 degrees to starboard. If a large wave hits her from the side beam on, in naval terminology, the additional rolling motion could push her past her stability point. At that angle, the laws of physics take over, and no amount of seamanship can save her. she'll capsize, roll completely over, and sink in minutes. Their only hope is to keep the bow pointed into the waves, taking them head-on, using the ship's length to ride over the swells instead of wallowing in them. But that requires power, requires the ability to maneuver, requires the engines to keep running, despite being fed by fuel tanks that are nearly empty. In the after-engine room, Chief Silva watches his fuel gauges with growing dread. They're down to 15%. Maybe 10 hours of steaming at current consumption. But the storm is forcing them to run the engines harder to maintain steerage, which means fuel consumption has increased. He's burning through their reserves faster than anticipated. "Chief," one of his firemen says nervously, "if we lose power in these seas—" "We don't lose power," Silva cuts him off. His voice is hard, brooking no doubt. "We keep these turbines running if we have to burn the deck planking for fuel. Clear?" "Clear, Chief." But Silva knows that determination won't keep fuel tanks full. They're facing a brutal equation. They need power to survive the storm, but using that power burns fuel they can't afford to lose. It's a race between the weather and their consumption, and Silva isn't sure which will kill them first. On deck, the skeleton crew fights a new battle. The storm is tearing at everything not secured, and plenty of things that were supposedly secured. A section of damaged aircraft breaks loose and slides across the canted flight deck, grinding toward the edge. If it goes over, it'll take 2 sailors with it, men who are desperately trying to secure a hatch that's threatening to blow open. Chaplain O'Callaghan sees the danger and doesn't hesitate. Despite his burned hands, despite 39 hours of continuous physical labor, despite being 52 years old and exhausted beyond measure, he sprints across the pitching deck and throws himself at the sliding wreckage. His weight isn't enough to stop it, but it slows the slide just enough for the 2 sailors to dive clear. The wreckage, a burned-out Corsair tail section weighing perhaps 800 pounds, continues its slide and goes over the side, taking O'Callaghan with it. Seaman Morrison sees the chaplain disappear over the edge and screams. He rushes to the rail, certain he's about to see O'Callaghan vanish into the dark, churning sea. But impossibly, the priest has caught himself on a protruding antenna mount, and he's hanging there, 70 feet above the water, his burned hands gripping metal they can barely feel. "Rope," Morrison shouts. "Someone get a rope." 3 sailors appear with a line. They secure one end to a stanchion and throw the other end down to O'Callaghan. The priest wraps it around his wrist. His hands are too damaged to grip properly, and they haul him up, dragging him over the rail and onto the deck. O'Callaghan lies there for a moment, gasping, his hands bleeding through the bandages. Then he starts laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that might be shock or might just be the absurdity of surviving bombs and fire and explosions only to nearly be killed by a piece of wreckage in a storm. "Father," Morrison says, his voice shaking. "Almost doesn't count, son," O'Callaghan interrupts, still laughing. "Almost is just another word for survived. Now help me up. We've got work to do." The storm intensifies through the night. Waves build to 15 feet, crashing over the Franklin's bow and sweeping down her ruined flight deck. The ship pitches violently, her bow rising and falling through 40-foot arcs. Each time she drops into a trough, the impact sends shudders through her entire structure, and sailors below decks can hear the groan of stressed metal. At 0100 hours, 42 hours after the attack, disaster nearly strikes. A particularly large wave hits the Franklin at a slight angle, and the ship begins to roll. 16 degrees. 17. 18. The list that had been stable for more than a day suddenly increases, and men on the bridge can feel the ship's center of gravity shifting. "Captain," the helmsman shouts. "She's rolling over." Garris grabs the engine order telegraph. "All ahead flank. Hard right rudder." It's a desperate gamble. By applying maximum power and turning into the roll, He's trying to use the ship's momentum to counteract the wave's force. But the engines are already straining. The fuel is critically low, and if this doesn't work, they're finished. The Franklin shudders as her overtaxed turbines respond. The starboard propeller shaft, the only one still functioning, bites into the churning water. The ship begins to turn, slowly, agonizingly, fighting against the wave's push. 18 degrees. 19. The roll continues, and Garrus can see loose equipment starting to slide across the deck. If they hit 20 degrees, they're past the point of recovery. Then, miraculously, the ship steadies. The bow comes around, facing into the wave, and the rolling motion reverses. 19 degrees, 18 and a half, 18, 17. They stabilize at 16 degrees, exactly where they started. Garrus realizes he's been holding his breath. He exhales slowly and looks at his bridge crew. They're white-faced, shaking, but they held their posts. "Good work," he says simply. "Let's not do that again." "Aye, sir," the helmsman responds, his voice barely above a whisper. But nature isn't done with them yet. At 0230 hours, the engineering spaces report a new crisis. Water is flooding into the after-engine room. Not from damage, but from the storm. The waves washing over the deck are finding their way through damaged hatches and ventilation ducts, pouring into spaces that are supposed to be watertight. Chief Silva watches the water rise around his ankles, then his shins, then his knees. He's got pumps running, but they can't keep up with the influx. The water is sloshing around the machinery, threatening electrical systems, creating the risk of shorts that could shut down the engines entirely. "Get damage control teams down here," Silva shouts into the phone. "We need those leaks sealed. Now." Lieutenant Gary, who should be resting, who should be nowhere near active duty with his burned hands, appears in the engine room 15 minutes later with a repair party. They're carrying wooden patches, quick-setting cement, anything that might slow the flooding. "Chief, where are the worst leaks?" Silva points to 3 locations where water is pouring in. Gary's team goes to work, and despite his injuries, despite his exhaustion, Gary helps them wedge patches into place, seal gaps with cement, do whatever it takes to keep the water out. It's crude work, emergency repairs that would make a shipyard engineer weep, but it works. The flooding slows. The pumps begin to gain ground. After 30 minutes of frantic effort, the water level in the engine room starts to drop. Silva looks at Gary at his bandaged hands, now soaked and filthy, at his face gray with pain and exhaustion, and says simply, "Thank you, sir." Gary nods, too tired for words, and heads back topside to check on other flooding reports. Because on the Franklin, there's always another crisis, always another emergency, always another problem that needs solving right now or everyone dies. The storm rages through the rest of the night and into the dawn of March 21st. For 8 hours, the Franklin fights the sea itself, and for 8 hours, she survives through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. When the sun finally rises on March 21st, 48 hours after the attack, the storm begins to break. The waves subside from 15 feet to 12, then 10, then 8. The wind drops from 50 knots to 40, then 30. The rain, which has been a solid wall of water for hours, becomes intermittent showers, and the Franklin, battered and bruised but still afloat, steams into calmer waters. Captain Garrus, who hasn't left the bridge in 12 hours, watches the storm clouds disperse and allows himself a moment of something that might almost be optimism. They've survived the bombs, the fires, the explosions, the magazines, the fuel tank, the storm. Every challenge the universe has thrown at them, they've somehow overcome. "Sir," Commander Jurica says quietly, appearing at his elbow. "The Pittsburgh signals that Ulithi is 480 miles ahead. At current speed, about 80 hours. 3.5 days. And our fuel status? 8% remaining. Maybe 6 hours at current consumption. Then we're running on fumes. Garris does the math. They need 80 hours to reach safety. They have 6 hours of fuel. The numbers are brutally clear. Signal to Pittsburgh. Request TOW. Fuel critical. Estimate engines shut down within 6 hours. It's an admission of defeat, in a way. An acknowledgement that despite everything they've survived, despite every miracle that's kept them afloat, they can't make it under their own power. But Garris has learned that pride is a luxury the dying can't afford. The Pittsburgh responds within minutes. Preparing TOW. Will commence operation at your signal. Well done, Franklin. Well done. As the morning progresses and the seas continue to calm, preparations begin for the most complex operation yet, passing a tow cable from the Pittsburgh to the Franklin in open ocean. It's a procedure that's difficult in calm waters with undamaged ships. With the Franklin listing, low in the water, and wallowing in residual swells from the storm, it's going to be nearly impossible. But then again, they've made a habit of doing the impossible. At 0900 hours on March 21st, 50 hours after the attack, the USS Pittsburgh begins the delicate ballet of positioning herself to pass a tow cable to the Franklin. Captain Gingrich brings his 13,000-ton cruiser to within 200 yards of the listing carrier, matching speed and course with the precision of a surgeon. On the Franklin's forecastle, the forward section of the main deck, Lieutenant Commander Taylor supervises a working party of 30 men. They're preparing to receive the tow cable, a massive steel rope 4 inches in diameter and weighing several tons. Under normal circumstances, this would be done with powered winches and coordinated by radio. But the Franklin's forward winches are destroyed. Her radios are barely functional, and they're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way, with manpower, seamanship, and prayer. All right, listen up, Taylor shouts over the wind. The Pittsburgh is going to fire a messenger line across to us using a line-throwing gun. We catch that line, use it to haul over a heavier line, then use that to pull the tow cable across. Simple in theory. In practice, with our list and this sea state, it's going to be a nightmare. So pay attention, follow orders, and for God's sake, don't let anyone get caught in the line. If that cable whips back, it'll cut a man in half. The sailors nod, their faces serious. They've seen enough death in the last 2 days to take every safety warning seriously. The Pittsburgh's line-throwing gun fires with a hollow thump. The messenger line arcs through the air, trailing smoke from the small rocket that propels it. It falls short by 30 feet, splashing into the water between the two ships. Second try. The line throws again, and this time it reaches the Franklin's deck. Sailors grab it, haul it in, and begin the laborious process of pulling the heavier line across. It's brutal work, pulling hundreds of feet of soaking wet hemp rope hand over hand while the ship pitches beneath their feet. After 20 minutes, they have the heavy line. Now comes the really hard part, pulling the tow cable itself. The cable weighs approximately 3 tons, and the Franklin's crew has to pull it across 200 yards of open ocean using nothing but muscle power. 50 men line up along the deck and begin to heave. The cable emerges from the water like some ancient sea serpent, dripping and heavy, resistant to every foot of progress. "Heave!" Taylor shouts in rhythm. "Heave! Heave!" The men pull in unison, their feet slipping on the wet deck, their hands burning despite heavy gloves. The cable inches forward, literally inches, sometimes only feet per minute. This is going to take hours. While the tow cable transfer proceeds, Captain Garris faces another crisis: the fuel situation. The engineering spaces report they're down to 4% fuel. Maybe 3 hours of steaming time remaining. Once the engines stop, the Franklin will be dead in the water, unable to maneuver, vulnerable to wind and current pushing her into dangerous positions. "Sir," Chief Silva reports via phone from the engine room, "I can stretch it a bit more if I shut down all non-essential systems. We can get maybe another hour if we cut power to pumps, lights, everything that's not critical to maintaining steerage." "Do it," Guerra's orders. "Every minute we can maintain power is another minute we have to get that tow cable secured." The ship begins shutting down. Lights flicker out. Ventilation fans spin to a stop. Pumps that have been fighting flooding for 2 days fall silent. The Franklin becomes darker, quieter, more tomb-like. But her propeller keeps turning, and that's all that matters. On the forecastle, the tow cable transfer continues. After 2 hours of backbreaking labor, the cable's eye loop at the end, reinforced with metal thimbles, finally reaches the Franklin's deck. Now they need to secure it to the ship's massive anchor chain, the only thing forward strong enough to handle the towing loads. This requires tools they don't have, and equipment that was destroyed in the attack. They improvise, using shackles salvaged from wreckage, chains from destroyed aircraft tie-down points, and anything else they can find. It's ugly, it's improvised, and it probably violates every Navy regulation about proper towing procedures. But it holds. "Cable secured," Taylor reports to the bridge at 1,315 hours. "Ready to commence tow." Garris signals to the Pittsburgh. "Tow cable secured, standing by to take strain." What happens next requires exquisite timing and seamanship from both ships. The Pittsburgh must slowly increase speed, gently taking up the slack in the cable, until the line becomes taut. If she goes too fast, the sudden jerk could snap the cable, or worse, tear the Franklin's bow structure completely off. If she goes too slow, the drifting ships might collide. Captain Gingrich handles it perfectly. The Pittsburgh eases forward, and the cable lying in a graceful curve between the two ships begins to lift out of the water. Slowly, gently, the strain increases. 100 tons of tension, 200, 300. The cable becomes bar-tight, thrumming with tension, water droplets flying off as it vibrates. The Franklin's bow begins to pull around, following the Pittsburgh's lead. They're connected now, one ship towing another, in a partnership that will last for the next 3 days. At 1,342 hours, 53 hours after the attack, the Franklin's engines finally shut down. Chief Silva watches his fuel gauges hit zero, watches his steam pressure drop, watches the turbines wind down into silence. For the first time in 2 days, the engine room is quiet. No roar of combustion, no whine of spinning machinery, just the creak of metal and the slosh of water in the bilges. "That's it, boys," Silva says to his crew. "We gave her everything we had. Now it's up to the Pittsburgh." His men exhausted, oil-stained, pushed beyond any reasonable limit, slump against machinery and bulkheads. Some cry from relief and release. Others just sleep where they stand, finally able to rest after 53 hours of keeping the Franklin's heart beating. Silva climbs topside to report to the captain and finds a ship transformed. Without engine power, the Franklin is utterly quiet except for the wind and waves. The damage is even more apparent in the stillness, the twisted wreckage, the burn scars, the evidence of catastrophic violence visited upon metal and men. But she's afloat, she's under tow, she's going home. "Chief Silva reporting, sir," he says formally when he reaches the bridge. "Engineering plant secured, all fuel exhausted, main propulsion offline." Garris turns from watching the Pittsburgh pull them forward slowly, carefully, but inexorably eastward. "Well done, Chief. You and your people kept us alive. Get some rest. You've earned it." Silva salutes and leaves, and Garris returns to watching the tow cable. The Pittsburgh is pulling the Franklin at 3 knots, barely faster than a walking pace. At this rate, it's going to take 4 days to reach Ulithi. 4 more days of hoping nothing breaks, no storms hit, No Japanese submarines find them, but they've survived worse odds. As afternoon fades into evening on March 21st, the situation aboard the Franklin stabilizes into something approaching routine. Damage control parties continue their work, now focused on long-term repairs rather than immediate survival. Medical teams treat the wounded, many of whom are finally stable enough to be transferred to the Pittsburgh or other escorts, and the crew, what's left of it, begins to process what they've been through. Chaplain O'Callaghan holds a voluntary service on the hangar deck. About 40 men attend, half the crew still aboard. They're not praying for survival anymore. They're past that crisis. Instead, they're praying for the souls of the dead, for strength for the wounded, and for the wisdom to understand why they survived when so many others didn't. "I don't know why we lived," O'Callaghan says honestly, his burned hands folded before him. "I don't know why Sullivan died, and we didn't. I don't know why some men were standing in the right place when the bombs hit, and others were in the wrong place. What I do know is that we have a duty to honor their sacrifice by living well, by living fully, by never forgetting what they gave." It's not a comfortable sermon. There's no talk of divine plans or everything happening for a reason. Just acknowledgement of the random brutality of war and the responsibility of survivors. But it's what these men need to hear. Lieutenant Gary, his hands finally treated properly by medical personnel from the Pittsburgh, sits alone on the gallery deck and writes letters. Letters to the families of men who died under his command. Letters to parents who will never see their sons again. Letters to wives who are now widows. He doesn't know what to say. There are no words adequate to explain that their loved ones burned to death, or were blown apart, or drowned in flooded compartments, or died in any of 100 horrible ways. So he keeps it simple. "Your son died saving his ship and his shipmates. He was brave. He will be remembered." It feels inadequate, but it's all he has. As night falls on March 21st, the Franklin continues her slow crawl toward safety. The tow cable stretches between her and the Pittsburgh, a literal lifeline connecting damage to rescue. Stars emerge overhead the first clear night in 2 days, and for a few hours, the ship is peaceful. But on the bridge, Captain Garris is reading intelligence reports, and they're disturbing. Japanese radio intercepts suggest the enemy knows the Franklin survived and is organizing search missions to find and finish her. Submarines are being repositioned. Aircraft are being prepped for long-range strikes. The race isn't over. They have 450 miles still to cover, and the Japanese want revenge for the ship that wouldn't die. Garris looks at the Pittsburgh, pulling them forward at 3 agonizing knots, and does the math. At this speed, they're covering 72 miles per day. 6 more days to safety. 6 more days for something to go wrong. He picks up the signal lamp and sends a message to every ship in the escort. "Maintain maximum vigilance. Enemy actively searching for us. We are not safe until we reach Ulithi." The escorts acknowledge, and the convoy continues into the night. The Franklin, towed and helpless, can only trust that her defenders will keep her safe for just a little bit longer. The finish line is in sight. They just have to survive long enough to reach it. March 22, 1945. The Franklin's third day of survival dawns with clear skies and calm seas conditions that would be perfect if they weren't so exposed. The convoy is now 250 miles from Ulithi, crawling eastward at 3 knots, and every mile feels like tempting fate. At 0630 hours, radar on the destroyer Hickox picks up a contact. Single aircraft, bearing 285 degrees, range 60 miles, altitude 8,000 feet. It's heading directly toward the Franklin. The combat air patrol. 4 Hellcats from the carrier Hancock vectors to intercept. The tension aboard the Franklin is palpable. Without propulsion, without aircraft, without functioning fire control systems, they're completely dependent on other ships for protection. If a Japanese bomber penetrates the cap, There's nothing the Franklin can do but watch it come in. The Hellcats close on the contact. At 40 miles, they identify it as a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, probably on a reconnaissance mission, searching for the Franklin. The lead Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Valencia, an ace with 23 kills to his name, doesn't give the Betty a chance to report. He closes to 200 yards and opens fire with his 6.50 caliber machine guns. The Betty explodes in midair, pieces tumbling into the Pacific below. Valencia radios back. Splash 1 Betty, area clear. On the Franklin's bridge, Captain Garris allows himself a moment of relief. The Japanese are hunting them, but they haven't found them yet, and every hour they stay hidden is another hour closer to safety. But the incident drives home a brutal reality. The Franklin is a wounded animal being stalked by predators. The Japanese know she survived and are determined to finish what they started. The next contact might not be just one reconnaissance plane. It might be a strike package of 20 bombers escorted by fighters, more than the thin cap can handle. Throughout the day, work continues on the Franklin. Despite being under tow, despite having no main power, the crew keeps fighting to improve their situation. Portable generators from the Pittsburgh provide electricity for essential systems. Welding crews work on structural repairs, trying to strengthen bulkheads weakened by fire and explosion. Pumping operations continue, slowly reducing the water in flooded compartments. Lieutenant Gary, working despite medical orders to rest, coordinates a comprehensive damage assessment. The results are staggering. Forward flight deck, 40% destroyed or structurally compromised. Hangar deck, 60% destroyed by fire. Forward elevator, completely destroyed. All forward aircraft, destroyed. 31 aircraft. All flight deck aircraft, destroyed. 31 aircraft. Forward fire control systems, destroyed. Primary communication systems, destroyed. 724 confirmed dead, 265 wounded. Structural damage to frames, bulkheads, and decking across 4 decks. By every metric, the Franklin should be at the bottom of the Pacific. The fact that she's still afloat, still structurally sound enough to survive being towed, is nothing short of miraculous. Sir, Gary reports to Captain Garris. The structural engineers from the Pittsburgh have reviewed the damage. Their assessment is that the Franklin is, and I quote, the most heavily damaged ship to remain afloat in naval history. They literally can't find a precedent for this level of damage survival. Garris studies the damage reports, his face unreadable. And their assessment of our ability to reach Ulithi? They're cautiously optimistic. The tow is holding, the hull integrity is better than expected, and as long as we don't encounter heavy weather, we should make it. Should being the operative word. Yes, sir, should. At 1,400 hours, another scare. Sonar on the destroyer Hickox detects a possible submarine contact, a faint acoustic signature that might be a Japanese I-boat stalking the convoy. The destroyers immediately form a protective screen around the Franklin and Pittsburgh, their sonars pinging actively, depth charges ready. For 2 hours, the contact plays cat and mouse with the destroyers. It appears on sonar, disappears, reappears at a different bearing. The destroyer captains can't get a solid enough fix to attack, but they can't rule out that it's a genuine threat. Finally, at 1,615 hours, the contact is identified as a biological, probably a whale. The tension eases, but the incident reinforces how vulnerable they are. A single torpedo could finish what the bomb started, and there would be no miraculous survival, no heroic firefighting. Just a quick trip to the bottom. As the sun sets on March 22, 72 hours after the attack, the Franklin has covered another 70 miles. They're now 180 miles from Ulithi. At their current pace, They'll arrive in 2.5 days sometime in the afternoon of March 25th. But fuel isn't the only thing running out. Medical supplies are critically low. Food stocks are depleted. The galley was destroyed in the attack, and they've been surviving on cold rations and whatever the Pittsburgh can spare. Fresh water is being rationed, and perhaps most critically, the crew is at the absolute limit of human endurance. Men are falling asleep at their posts, despite the danger. Others are showing signs of combat fatigue, shaking hands, inability to concentrate, emotional outbursts. Doc Wassman reports an increasing number of medical issues that have nothing to do with injuries. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, psychological breakdown. Captain, Commander Jurica says privately, we need to get more men off this ship. We're down to 80 still aboard, and half of them are in no condition to continue. If we have another emergency, then we handle it with whoever's available. Garris cuts him off. I'm not evacuating more crew until we're safely in port. Every man we send off is a man we might need if something goes wrong. And if men start dying from exhaustion? Garris doesn't have a good answer for that. He's weighing impossible calculus. The risk of keeping exhausted men aboard against the risk of having too few crew to handle an emergency. There's no right answer, only choices with different consequences. We're 72 hours in, he finally says. Another 60 hours to Ulithi. We can last 60 more hours. Jurica nods. But both men know it's more hope than certainty. March 23rd dawns, and the Franklin continues her slow march toward safety. The tow cable has held for more than 48 hours now, a testament to both the Pittsburgh's careful handling and the improvised but effective securing job on the Franklin's forecastle. But strain is showing in the cable itself. Under constant tension, cycling through temperature changes, subjected to the corrosive salt environment, microscopic cracks are forming in the steel strands. Lieutenant Commander Taylor, inspecting the cable every 4 hours, reports increasing fraying at the attachment points. Sir, we need to reinforce this cable, he tells Garris. The Pittsburgh can send over a second cable run it parallel to the first, distribute the load. But it'll take most of the day to rig. Do it, Garris orders. We're not losing this tow 72 hours from port because we didn't take precautions. The process of rigging a second tow cable is even more complex than the first. Both ships have to maintain perfect synchronization while a second massive steel rope is transferred across. It takes 8 hours of painstaking work, but by 1600 hours on March 23rd, the Franklin is being towed by 2 cables, the load distributed more safely. As evening falls on the 4th day of survival, the Franklin is now just 110 miles from Ulithi. The finish line is tantalizingly close, but a new problem emerges. The entrance to Ulithi Atoll is through a narrow channel, barely wide enough for a carrier under the best circumstances. The Franklin, listing 16 degrees and being towed by 2 cables from another ship, is going to have to navigate that channel without the ability to maneuver independently. It's going to require perfect coordination between the Franklin, the Pittsburgh, and the harbor pilots at Ulithi. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the Franklin could run aground on the coral reefs that line the channel. After everything they've survived, they could lose the ship within sight of safety. Captain Garris calls his senior officers together for what might be the last planning session of this nightmare voyage. Gentlemen, we're 96 hours into the impossible. We've survived bombs, fire, explosions, storms, and enemy searches. We're not going to fail because we couldn't navigate a harbor entrance. Commander Taylor, I want a detailed plan for the channel transit. Work with the Pittsburgh. I want to know every contingency, every backup plan, every possible failure mode. Aye, sir. Commander Jurica, coordinate with Ulithi Base. I want tugs standing by, harbor pilots ready, medical teams on the pier, and every piece of support they can provide. The Franklin is coming home, and she's coming home in style. There's grim laughter at that. In style is not how anyone would describe the Franklin's current state. But the sentiment is clear. They've earned their survival, and they're not going to slink into port like a defeated vessel. They're going to arrive as what they are, a ship that refused to die. March 24th, 5th day of survival. The Franklin is 40 miles from Ulithi, and the end is finally, genuinely in sight. The crew, what's left of them, can feel it. The change in atmosphere is palpable. Men who've been running on fumes for days suddenly find reserves of energy. There's talking, even some laughter. For the first time in 5 days, someone sings a off-key rendition of Anchor's Awe that spreads through the ship. But Captain Garris remains vigilant. They're not safe until they're tied to a pier. The Japanese could still find them. The tow cables could still snap. A dozen things could still go wrong. At 1,400 hours on March 24th, the Franklin passes through the outer markers of Ulithi Atoll. The harbor, one of the largest natural anchorages in the Pacific, is crowded with ships. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, supply vessels, the entire assembled might of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And as the Franklin enters the harbor, something extraordinary happens. The ships start sounding their horns. The sound begins with the battleship Missouri, one long, deep blast from her horn that rolls across the water like thunder. Then the Iowa joins in, her horn adding to the chorus. Then the Wisconsin, the carriers Yorktown, Intrepid, and Wasp, the cruisers, the destroyers, the support vessels. Within seconds, every ship in Ulithi Harbor is sounding its horn in salute. The noise is deafening, overwhelming. On the Franklin's bridge, Captain Garris stands rigid at attention, his eyes suddenly wet. Around him, his bridge crew men, who've fought for 5 days without rest, who've survived hell itself, are crying openly. Because this isn't just a salute. It's recognition. It's the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet acknowledging what they accomplished, honoring the 724 men who died, and celebrating the impossible survival of the ship that wouldn't die. Chaplain O'Callaghan stands on the gallery deck, his burned hands pressed against his chest, tears streaming down his face. Beside him, Seaman Morrison is sobbing, so is Chief Silva, and Lieutenant Gary, and dozens of other sailors scattered across the Franklin's battered deck. They're not tears of sadness, they're tears of release, of accomplishment, of sheer, overwhelming relief that they made it. Against every odd, despite every disaster, through fire and explosion and storm and enemy action, they made it home. The horn salute continues for a full 3 minutes, and when it finally ends, spontaneous cheering breaks out across the harbor. Thousands of sailors on hundreds of ships are lining the rails, waving their caps, shouting themselves hoarse in tribute. The Franklin, listing heavily, her forward section a charred ruin, her flight deck twisted and torn, makes her way slowly toward her assigned berth. The Pittsburgh carefully guides her through the narrow channel, the 2 tow cables taut between them. Harbor tugs close in to assist, their crews gaping at the extent of the damage. One tug captain, an old Navy salt named McCready, who's been handling ships for 30 years, radios to his dispatcher. "Sweet Jesus, how is she still afloat? I've seen ships with 1/10 this damage go straight to the bottom." The Franklin edges toward the pier with agonizing slowness. At 1,647 hours, on March 25th, 1,945. 5 days, 9 hours, and 40 minutes after the Japanese attack. Her lines are secured to Pier 7 at Ulithi Atoll. She's home. Captain Garris stands on the bridge and formally orders, "Secure from towing stations. Rig for pierside operations." Then, more quietly, to himself, "Well done, Franklin. Well done. The pier is crowded with personnel, medical teams with stretchers, damage control specialists, eager to assess the ship, supply officers ready to provide whatever's needed, and Admiral Mitcher himself, come to personally greet the crew who achieved the impossible. The first priority is evacuating the wounded. Stretchers are carried across the brow, the gangway connecting ship to shore in a steady stream. Men with burns, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation damage, broken bones. Doc Wassman personally accompanies the most critical cases, his face lined with exhaustion, but his bearing still professional. He's kept 50 men alive for 5 days with minimal supplies and under impossible conditions. Now, he can finally hand them over to proper medical facilities. Lieutenant Gary is carried off on a stretcher despite his protests. His hands need surgery, multiple surgeries, probably, and the medical officers from the base hospital aren't taking no for an answer. As he's carried past Captain Garris, he manages a salute with his bandaged hands. Garris returns the salute formally. "You saved this ship, Lieutenant. Multiple times. The Navy owes you a debt it can never repay." "Just doing my job, sir," Gary responds, then adds with a slight smile, "Though maybe next time I'll pick an easier assignment." Chief Silva walks off under his own power, though he's leaning heavily on 2 of his engine room crew. He's lost 20 pounds in 5 days, his face is gaunt with exhaustion, and he can barely stand. But he walks off, because that's what chiefs do. Chaplain O'Callaghan is one of the last to leave. He makes a final tour of the ship, saying goodbye to the vessel that's been his home, his church, and nearly his tomb. When he finally walks down the brow, his hands are wrapped in fresh bandages and his cassock retrieved from somewhere, cleaned and pressed, is draped over his shoulders. Admiral Mitcher is waiting at the foot of the brow. He salutes O'Callaghan formally, and the gesture speaks volumes. Admirals don't salute chaplains technically. Chaplains don't hold military rank in the traditional sense. But this isn't about rank. It's about respect. "Father," Mitcher says simply, "the Navy thanks you for your service." O'Callaghan returns the salute with his bandaged hands. "The honor was mine, Admiral. By 1900 hours, the Franklin is empty except for Captain Garris and a skeleton security watch. The damage assessment teams from the base are waiting to come aboard, but Garris has asked for an hour alone with his ship first." He walks through the wreckage slowly, taking it all in. The burned hangar deck, where hundreds of men died in the first minutes of the attack. The twisted flight deck, where Chaplain O'Callaghan organized bucket brigades against an inferno. The magazine spaces, where Lieutenant Commander Wassman and his men flooded the explosives seconds before they would have detonated. The engine room, where Chief Silva kept the heart beating for 53 hours straight. Every compartment has a story. Every section bears scars. And throughout it all, Garris can feel the presence of the 724 men who didn't make it home. This ship is their monument, their memorial, their grave. He ends his tour on the bridge, where he's spent most of the last 5 days. The windows are shattered, the equipment is ruined, but the view is the same. Forward, toward whatever comes next. Commander Jurica finds him there, standing at attention, saluting an empty chair, the captain's chair, where he's made every decision that kept them alive. "Sir," Jurica says gently, "the damage assessment team is requesting permission to come aboard." Garris lowers his salute. "Granted. And Commander, thank you for everything. It was an honor to serve with you, sir, and with this ship." Over the following days, the full extent of the Franklin's damage becomes clear. Naval engineers conduct a comprehensive survey and produce a report that's nothing short of staggering. USS Franklin, CFE 13. Damage Assessment, March 1945. Summary. The USS Franklin sustained catastrophic damage from 2 Japanese bomb hits and subsequent fires and explosions. The damage is unprecedented in severity for a ship that remained afloat and was successfully brought to port. Key findings: 60% of flight deck destroyed or structurally compromised. 75% of hangar deck destroyed by fire. All embarked aircraft destroyed, 62 total. Forward third of ship sustained severe fire and explosion damage. 832 casualties. 724 KIA. 265 WIA. Highest single-day casualties for any surviving U.S. warship. Estimated repair time: 14 to 18 months. Estimated repair cost: $48 million, $1,945. Recommendation: despite extensive damage, the ship's structure remains fundamentally sound. Recommend full repair and return to service. The news spreads throughout the Pacific Fleet and back to the United States. The Franklin's survival becomes headline news. Radio broadcasts describe the miracle carrier. Newspapers run photographs of the damaged ship alongside stories of heroism and survival. 3 days after arriving at Ulithi, Captain Garris receives a message from Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. To Commanding Officer USS Franklin, your ship and crew have demonstrated the highest traditions of the naval service. The survival of CV-13 against overwhelming damage is without precedent in naval history. Well done to all hands. But the most meaningful recognition comes from the crew themselves. On March 28th, the surviving members of the Franklin's crew, those who stayed aboard during the crisis, gather for a formal ceremony. They're presenting themselves, by their own initiative, for a group photograph. 73 men stand on what's left of the Franklin's flight deck. They're wearing dress uniforms hastily assembled from spare gear. Many have bandages visible under their sleeves, some are on crutches, but they stand at attention, proud, survivors of an ordeal that should have killed them all. The photograph is taken, and it becomes iconic. 73 faces staring at the camera, with expressions that mix pride, exhaustion, grief, and defiant survival. The caption, written by one of the crew, reads simply, "The ship that wouldn't die, and the men who saved her." In the weeks that follow, recommendations for medals flood through the Navy's bureaucracy. Captain Leslie Garris, Lieutenant Donald Gary, Medal of Honor, for repeatedly entering burning sections to rescue trapped personnel and prevent explosions. Chaplain Joseph O'Callaghan, Medal of Honor, for conspicuous gallantry and leadership beyond the call of duty. The first chaplain, so honored, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taylor, Chief Machinist's Mate Raymond Silva, Navy Cross for maintaining propulsion under extreme conditions. Commander Stephen Jurica, Navy Cross for executive leadership during crisis, and dozens more Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Navy, and Marine Corps medals. Because what happened on the Franklin wasn't the work of a few heroes. It was the collective achievement of hundreds of men who simply refused to accept that their ship was doomed. On April 3, 1945, the Franklin departs Ulithi under her own power barely. Her engineers have managed to restore one engine, giving her enough speed to make the journey to Pearl Harbor for temporary repairs. She's still listing, still heavily damaged, but she's steaming. The voyage to Pearl Harbor takes 12 days, and when she arrives, crowds line the shore to watch the wounded carrier enter harbor. She ties up at the Navy Yard, and the long process of rebuilding begins. But the Franklin will never return to combat. The war ends before her repairs are complete. She's relegated to training duty, then eventually placed in reserve, and finally scrapped in 1966. But her legacy lives on. The story of the USS Franklin doesn't end at a pier in Ulithi or even in the scrapyard 21 years later. It lives on in the men who survived, in the families who lost loved ones, and in the lessons learned from 5 days that redefined what's possible when human determination confronts impossible odds. Lieutenant Donald Gary returns to the United States in June 1945. His hands will never fully recover, the nerve damage is permanent, leaving him with limited dexterity and chronic pain. But on December 11, 1945, he stands in the White House as President Harry Truman drapes the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation reads, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." Lieutenant Gary repeatedly led rescue parties into burning compartments, fighting through fire, smoke, and explosion to reach trapped personnel. His valor and disregard for his own safety saved the lives of hundreds of his shipmates and prevented the loss of his ship. Gary accepts the medal quietly, and in his brief remarks, he says only, "This belongs to every man who stayed aboard that ship. I just happened to be the one they picked to represent all of us." He's right, of course, but his specific acts, the magazine flooding, the fuel tank venting, the repeated rescue missions were above and beyond even the extraordinary heroism displayed by the entire crew. Chaplain Joseph O'Callaghan receives his Medal of Honor in January 1946, becoming the first chaplain in U.S. military history to receive the nation's highest award for valor. The citation describes his leadership in organizing firefighting efforts, his disregard for personal safety, and his role in moving unexploded ordnance. But what it can't quite capture is the spiritual leadership he provided, the way his presence and determination kept men fighting when giving up would have been easier. O'Callaghan returns to Holy Cross College and resumes teaching physics. He never speaks publicly about the Franklin unless pressed, and when he does, he always deflects credit to the sailors he served with. "I was just doing my job," he tells interviewers. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. He dies in 1964, and his funeral is attended by hundreds of Franklin survivors who travel from across the country to honor the priest who helped save their lives. Captain Leslie Garris continues his naval career, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He never commands another ship in combat, but he becomes an influential voice in damage control doctrine, teaching at the Naval War College and helping to write new procedures based on lessons learned from the Franklin. In his later years, Garris struggles with what today would be recognized as survivor's guilt and PTSD. He has nightmares about the attack, about the decisions he made, about the men who died under his command. In a private letter to a fellow officer, he writes, "I made the hardest decision of my life when I gave the abandoned ship order, and the second hardest when I decided to stay and fight for her. 724 men died on my watch. I'll carry that weight until the day I die. But I'd make the same decisions again, because the alternative was letting everyone die. Command is hell, George. It's choosing between bad options and living with the consequences." He dies in 1975 and is buried with full military honors. Chief Machinist's mate Raymond Silva returns to the Merchant Marine after the war, eventually becoming a chief engineer on commercial vessels. He retires in 1967 and spends his remaining years in California, where he's active in Franklin survivor reunions. He's known for his storytelling epic accounts of keeping the engines running, told with humor and humility that belie the desperate nature of what he accomplished. Commander Stephen Jurica becomes a rear admiral and serves as a naval attaché and intelligence officer. His experience on the Franklin shapes his approach to crisis management and leadership development. He writes extensively about the importance of maintaining calm under pressure and the value of distributed decision-making when communication breaks down. But what about the others? The sailors whose names don't appear in history books, who didn't receive medals, who simply did their jobs under impossible circumstances. Seaman First Class William Morrison, the 18-year-old who O'Callaghan saved from burning, returns to Iowa. He works at a grain elevator for 40 years, raises 4 children, and lives a quiet life. But every March 19th, he raises an American flag and stands in silent tribute to the men who died saving the Franklin. When he dies in 1998, his obituary mentions his service on the carrier that wouldn't die, and his family learns for the first time just how close they came to never existing. Pharmacist's mate third-class Robert Wassman receives a battlefield commission and becomes a doctor after the war. He specializes in burn treatment, driven by his experiences treating Franklin casualties with minimal supplies. He pioneers several techniques for treating severe burns that become standard practice. When asked why he chose this specialty, he says simply, "Because I couldn't save everyone on the Franklin. Maybe I can save someone else's shipmates." Boatswain's mate second-class George Sullivan, who died in the backdraft explosion 3 days after surviving the initial attack, is posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. His widow, Eleanor, receives the medal at a ceremony in Boston. She keeps it in a frame alongside George's photograph for the rest of her life, and when she dies in 1989, she's buried beside him with the medal placed between their graves. The Franklin survivors form an association in 1947, holding annual reunions where they share memories, honor the dead, and maintain the bonds forged in fire. The reunions continue for decades, the attendance slowly dwindling as age claims the survivors one by one. At the 1995 reunion, the 50th anniversary of the attack, only 37 survivors attend. They're in their 70s and 80s now, gray-haired and slow-moving, but when they stand for the national anthem, they stand straight, and when they salute the flag, the motion is crisp and precise. The final reunion is held in 2015, 70 years after the attack. Only 4 survivors attend. 1 former sailor, 1 Marine, 1 officer, and 1 pilot who was in the air when the attack occurred, and returned to find his carrier transformed into an inferno. They stand together on the deck of the USS Intrepid, now a museum ship in New York, and look out at the water. They don't talk much at this age. With these memories, words seem inadequate. They simply stand together, 4 old men who once did the impossible, remembering the 724 who didn't survive to grow old. The last Franklin survivor dies in 2019 at age 96. His obituary sparks renewed interest in the ship's story, and for a few weeks, the Franklin trends on social media as people discover the incredible tale of survival they'd never heard before. But the real legacy of the Franklin isn't just in the survival of the ship. It's in what the Navy learned from that day of horror: damage control doctrine. The Franklin's survival revolutionized naval damage control procedures. The Navy created new training programs based on lessons learned, emphasizing decentralized decision-making, cross-training personnel in multiple roles, and maintaining the ability to function even when communication breaks down. Aircraft carrier design. Future carriers incorporated design changes inspired by the Franklin's damage: better compartmentation, redundant systems, improved fire suppression, and modifications to reduce vulnerability to cascading failures. All emerged from analyzing what went wrong and right on March 19, 1945. Medal of Honor standards. The Franklin produced 2 Medal of Honor recipients from a single action, setting precedents for recognizing extreme valor in damage control and rescue operations, not just combat against enemy forces. Leadership philosophy. Military leadership courses still study Captain Garris's decision-making, particularly his willingness to reverse the abandoned ship order and his focus on maintaining crew morale during an extended crisis. But perhaps most importantly, the Franklin story reminds us of something fundamental about human nature. When faced with impossible odds, when every rational calculation says defeat is certain, some people simply refuse to quit. They fight on, not because victory seems likely, but because surrender is unacceptable. Aircraft carrier design. Future carriers incorporated design changes inspired by the Franklin's damage: better compartmentation, redundant systems, improved fire suppression, and modifications to reduce vulnerability to cascading failures all emerged from analyzing what went wrong and right on March 19, 1945. Medal of Honor Standards. The Franklin produced 2 Medal of Honor recipients from a single action, setting precedents for recognizing extreme valor in damage control and rescue operations, not just combat against enemy forces. Leadership philosophy. Military leadership courses still study Captain Garris's decision-making, particularly his willingness to reverse the abandoned ship order and his focus on maintaining crew morale during an extended crisis. But perhaps most importantly, the Franklin story reminds us of something fundamental about human nature. When faced with impossible odds, when every rational calculation says, defeat is certain, some people simply refuse to quit. They fight on, not because victory seems likely, but because surrender is unacceptable.